Mary Phillips was born in 1961 in Bradford, a small town in Arkansas. During her high school years, she met James Phillips, her lifelong love. They started dating at that time and eventually married. Mary became a devoted wife and mother to 3 children. Their first child, Darla, was born in 1979, followed by Jessie 2 years later, and their youngest daughter, Lacey, was born in 1984. The Phillips family spent several years living in Hope before moving in 1990 to the quaint town of Bald Knob, also in Arkansas. Mary was known for her deep religious beliefs and was regarded by those who knew her as a wonderful person with a radiant smile that could light up any room. Professionally, Mary trained as an accountant and worked at a tax office. In her free time, she enjoyed spending time with her family, gardening, and engaging in outdoor activities. On June 6, 1995, at the age of 34, Mary went to work as usual while her husband was away on a business trip. That afternoon, Darla dropped off her younger sister Lacey, who was 11 at the time, at their mother's office since Mary was supposed to take Lacey to a dentist appointment after work. Darla then left to attend a friend's birthday party, kissing her mother goodbye and telling her she loved her. Later that evening, Jesse, the Phillips' second child, grew worried when neither his mother nor Lacey had returned home. He called his father, who was out of town. James instructed his son to check if Mary had been in an accident nearby. Jesse followed his father's advice but could not find her. James then asked Jesse to stay at home, believing Mary might return at any moment. As the night progressed and there was still no sign of Mary and Lacey, James's concern grew, leading him to contact the police to report his wife and daughter missing since 3 p.m. the previous day. Upon receiving the report, 3 police officers went to Mary's workplace. In the parking lot, they found a lone truck parked beside the building, which was registered to Mary. One of the officers entered the office and discovered Mary dead, with her hands bound behind her back and naked from the waist down. The officer immediately alerted his colleagues, who began their investigation by noticing drag marks leading to the bathroom door. Upon opening it, they found Lacey tied to a chair and brutally beaten. The officers initially believed the girl might have also died due to her severe condition. A detective who was photographing the crime scene captured an image with a flash where Lacey was lying. To his astonishment, Lacey turned her head and looked directly at him. Her brown hair, matted and darkened by blood, covered the right side of her face. Despite her grave injuries, Lacey had survived for about 10 hours tied up. She asked about her mother, and the detective could only reassure her to stay calm and try to rest until the ambulance arrived. He was struck by the child's bravery. Lacey had to pass by her mother's body to leave the office and was urgently taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. She had severe head injuries that required surgery and a stay in the intensive care unit. Meanwhile, the police contacted James, urging him to return home immediately. He packed his bags and drove back, unaware of the details of the situation. Once Lacey's condition stabilized, she was able to describe her attacker, providing details about his appearance, clothing, hairstyle, and tattoos, one on his arm and another resembling a tear under his left eye. Her description was crucial in helping the police identify the suspect as Jack Johnson Jr., a man known to them due to multiple previous arrests for burglary, theft, and drug use. Detectives then went to question him. A state police investigator interviewed Jack, who was 30 years old at the time. Surprisingly, Jack confessed to the crime without any pressure, detailing his actions. At one point, he even mentioned that if he could, he would take the investigator's gun and end his life right there. His demeanor during the interrogation and the chilling details he provided about the attack made it evident to the officers that Jack had acted with absolute cold-bloodedness. Jack claimed that his actions were motivated by revenge and anger because his wife had been sexually assaulted and the police had not thoroughly investigated the incident. However, there is no precise information about when or to whom Jack was married, nor about the incident he referred to. According to the detective's investigation, on that fateful day, June 6, 1995, Jack saw Mary enter the building where she worked while he was painting a sign nearby. Later, when Lacey was already in the office with her mother, he decided to enter. Some sources say he used the excuse of looking for a job, while others claim he asked to borrow some accounting books, after which he left. However, he returned that same day with a gun, latex gloves, and wire. Jack forced Mary to lie face down on the floor and made Lacey do the same on top of her mother before robbing the cash register. He then tied their hands with wire and took Lacey to a bathroom, where he strapped her to a chair. The little girl pleaded with him not to hurt her mother, to which he responded by saying he would harm her instead. He then struck Lacey at least 8 times on the head with the gun, causing her to lose consciousness. Jack returned to the room where Mary was, struck her on the head, and sexually assaulted her. Mary fought back with all her might, but Jack overpowered her by strangling her with his hands. He then wrapped the coffee maker's electrical cord around her body until she stopped breathing. Meanwhile, Lacey regained consciousness and, realizing she was injured, began calling out for her mother. Jack went back to the bathroom and choked Lacey until she passed out again. She was gravely injured with multiple fractures and barely clinging to life. Believing the child had died, Jack left her in the small room and fled the scene. But who was this man capable of committing such a heinous act? Jack was born on August 10, 1964, in Toledo, Ohio. His father was an alcoholic and his mother had gambling problems. Jack was one of 7 siblings but had a particularly close relationship with the youngest, who was a year and a half younger than him. Jack suffered a high fever and seizures when he was just a year old. He was later diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, and at the age of 5, he began taking Ritalin as part of his treatment. Around this time, he also started experiencing hallucinations. It was also revealed that Jack suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child and was said to exhibit 2 personalities. On one hand, he could be a loving and affectionate child who enjoyed drawing and telling stories. On the other hand, he could become filled with rage and react violently, often lashing out at family members. As he grew older, Jack began acting violently towards animals, killing several of them. He also got into numerous troubles with the police and was eventually placed in a juvenile detention center. There, he was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, antisocial behavior, and a tendency to bang his head against cabinets. At a young age, Jack became addicted to alcohol and other drugs, seemingly as a way to escape the pain he had endured. This cocktail of abuse, illness, and substance use made Jack a man unable to control his life. Physically, Jack was distinguished by a series of tattoos, including hearts and barbed wire on his arms and wrists. In 1985, Jack had a daughter with a woman whose details remain unknown. The child was put up for adoption and raised in Toledo by a family that provided her with a comfortable and protected life. Jack was a tormented man who attempted suicide twice, once in 1989 and again in 1991 when he jumped off a bridge. In 1995, he voluntarily admitted himself to a mental health center, reporting suicidal thoughts. After evaluation, experts diagnosed him with bipolar disorder. According to case reviews, He used methamphetamines to cope with this mental illness, which causes extreme mood swings from euphoria and irritability to depression. These changes can affect sleep, energy, activity levels, judgment, behavior, and clarity of thought. Bipolar disorder is a lifelong condition that can be managed with treatment, typically involving medication and psychological support. After seeking help at the mentioned institution, Jack left after 6 days, although the circumstances of his departure are unclear. 6 months after his brief stay at the mental health center, Jack committed the horrific attack that took the life of a loving mother and left 3 children motherless, and James without the love of his life. A few days after Jack's arrest, a preliminary hearing was held at the county circuit court. During Jack's trial, the district attorney sought the death penalty, arguing that Jack was a dangerous man likely to commit another violent crime. Reports indicated that during one of the hearings, Jack himself asked to be executed immediately. One of the key witnesses, Investigator Howard, recounted Jack's detailed confession of the crime. Additionally, evidence was presented, including the photograph taken of Lacey at the crime scene when officers initially believed she had died from the beating Jack inflicted. Another significant moment was when Lacey, who had survived the attack, took the witness stand and identified Jack as the perpetrator. Jack pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, expressing deep remorse for his actions and stating that he was haunted by the ghosts of his victims. He claimed he could not forgive himself and would willingly give up his life if it could undo the harm he caused. On April 17, 1996, the jury delivered its verdict. Jack was found guilty. He was sentenced to death for murdering Mary Phillips, received a life sentence for sexually assaulting her, and an additional 30 years for the attempted murder of Lacey Phillips, along with a $15,000 fine. In the years following, Jack's defense team filed numerous appeals against his conviction, focusing on mitigating evidence and the legality of Arkansas's death penalty laws. The attorneys argued that they were not allowed to present critical evidence to the jury that could have mitigated the sentence, such as reports confirming his bipolar disorder and constant hallucinations. They also pointed out that only $6,400 had been spent on his defense, whereas a comprehensive investigation would typically cost tens of thousands of dollars. Additionally, they relied on an expert who was later deemed incompetent by the state medical board. Meanwhile, the Phillips family struggled to adjust to life without Mary. Darla took on the role of an improvised mother, cleaning the house, preparing meals, and taking care of Lacey and Jesse. While awaiting execution on Arkansas's death row, Jack's genetic profile was entered into the National DNA Database. This eventually led to the revelation of dark secrets from his past. In 2002, a detective reopened the case of Lorraine Ann Barrett, a 32-year-old woman from Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, who was murdered in June 1991. Lorraine, known as Laurie, graduated in 1977 from South Fayette High School and worked as a customer service representative for a telephone company in Washington, Pennsylvania. She was on vacation in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, when she met her assailant at a bar where she was last seen. Witnesses reported that a man with multiple tattoos accompanied her to her room at the Days Inn Lauderdale South Motel. Once in the room, the man beat her, assaulted her, and strangled her to death before fleeing. In the early hours of June 1, 1991, a maintenance worker found Laurie's body in her hotel room. The police were immediately notified, and an investigation began to identify the attacker. Authorities created a composite sketch of the suspect, describing a man with several tattoos, including barbed wire and hearts with names. This information was distributed throughout the county. When Jack's sister, saw the description and sketch of the man wanted for the murder of a woman, she immediately thought it resembled her brother. Although she didn't believe Jack was guilty and thought it was a case of mistaken identity, she still told their father. He advised her not to tell their mother. Subsequently, their father put Jack on a bus to Arkansas. Despite their efforts, the police could not locate the culprit, and the case quickly went cold. 12 years after Lori's death, the case was reopened. The detectives sent fluid samples collected from Lori's body and the crime scene to be compared with databases that hadn't existed when the crime occurred. The following year, the system found a match with Jack's DNA archived in Arkansas. Based on this result, a second test was conducted at the State Forensic Laboratory, conclusively proving that Jack had committed the crime against Lori. It was also determined that his tattoos and features matched those of the suspect who had murdered the tourist in Fort Lauderdale. Florida authorities then issued an extradition order for Jack, who was at that time in maximum security prison in Arkansas, appealing his sentence for the third time after being condemned to death. Jack would now face justice again on charges of first-degree murder and sexual assault in Broward County. Once in Fort Lauderdale, Jack met the detective who was handling Lori's case. To the detective, it was evident that Jack was a serial killer. He earned Jack's trust, leading to Jack's confession that he had killed another person in Broward County. Although Jack didn't provide the victim's name, he promised that he would reveal his secret someday. A similar situation occurred between Jack and his sister during one of her prison visits. She asked if there were other victims, and he admitted there was one more but didn't give any details, promising to explain everything in a letter when the time came. For Lori's family, discovering after so long who had taken her life was both a shock and a relief. Her sister stated that it was the news she had always wanted to hear, but learning about it this way was overwhelming because it was so unexpected. Finally, in 2005, Jack was tried for Lori's murder. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was then returned to Arkansas to await his execution. A couple of years later, Jack's defense continued to seek clemency. His lawyer argued in a hearing that the jury forms in Jack's trial contained contradictory information and pointed out that such ambiguities were typically resolved with new sentencing hearings ordered by the Supreme Court. He also argued that Jack's bipolar disorder had not been adequately presented to the jury, explaining that while it didn't excuse his actions, it did offer an explanation. Despite the clemency hearings not succeeding, Jack's execution was postponed multiple times over the years. Among other reasons, this was due to various illnesses he suffered, including high blood pressure and diabetes, which eventually led to the amputation of his leg. In parallel, in 2010, Jack's biological daughter wanted to learn about her biological parents. She filed a petition with a probate court to disclose her birth certificate, which had her mother's contact information. She called her mother and discovered that her father was Jack, a man on death row in Arkansas. As a single mother of two, she struggled to process this reality. She was shocked, filled with guilt and confusion about the man who had fathered her, but also grateful for the family that had raised her. Feeling compelled to reach out, she wrote a letter to Jack in prison. Soon after, she began receiving boxes of Jack's writings and paintings he had made for her two young children. While she knew Jack deserved to be in prison for his crimes, she also felt that he had changed. Jack's execution was scheduled for November 14, 2015, but it was suspended due to legal challenges related to the drugs used in the execution procedures. In 2017, the state of Arkansas decided to resume executions, and among those scheduled was Jack. In April of that year, a new clemency hearing was held, but Jack refused to attend, opting instead to send a handwritten letter to the state parole board for his lawyer to read. In the letter, he expressed regret not only for his actions but also for the hearing itself, stating he was ready to face death at the hands of the state. He forgave his executioners, acknowledging someone had to carry out his sentence. Jack made it clear that he would reject any commutation from a death sentence to life imprisonment, as he refused to spend any more time in what he described as a rat hole prison. He felt he had no right to seek forgiveness and was tormented by his actions toward Mary and her daughter, attributing his crimes to years of mental illness, abuse, drugs, and poor decisions. Jack's lawyer highlighted his shame and remorse. During the hearing, Lacey, who by then was 32 years old and married, declared that she didn't want to live another day knowing Jack was still alive. She expressed frustration that more than 20 years after the incident, justice had yet to be served. For the Phillips family, the delays in Jack's execution had been a torturous journey, preventing closure for the horrors Mary and Lacey endured. After 21 years on death row, Jack prepared to face his sentence and declared himself ready to die. He gave his sister a letter written in 2006, instructing her to open it a year after his execution date. Jack's biological daughter traveled to Arkansas to see her father for the first and last time, the day before his execution. They held hands, tried to maintain a cheerful attitude, forgave each other for past hurts, and reminisced about her birth. Jack gave his daughter his wedding ring, which she now wears on a chain around her neck. On April 24, 2017, Jack consumed his last meal: fried chicken, potato wedges with tartar sauce, beef jerky, 3 candy bars, and a chocolate shake. Around 7 p.m., he gave a 2-minute final statement apologizing to Lacey, expressing disbelief at how he had hurt her and professing his love for her as if she were his own daughter. He added that he hoped in time they could understand who he truly was and that he was not a monster. In a controversial statement, he implied there was a reason for the tragic events of that fateful day. He also left a written note stating that he aimed to become a better person in prison, practicing Buddhism and studying physics, and that no words could fully convey his remorse. At 52 years old, Jack was executed alongside another death row inmate, Marcel Williams, marking the first double execution in the United States in 17 years. His death was pronounced at 7 p.m., making him the 1,450th person executed in the U.S. since 1976. Mary's husband, James, lamented the long wait for justice, but felt relief at its eventual achievement. He also expressed sympathy for Jack's family during their ordeal. Jack's sister stated she felt pain for the victims and prayed for them constantly, acknowledging Jack needed to be punished for his unforgivable acts. However, she also remembered him as a loving child and wanted to be present at his execution to support him, though the Arkansas Department of Correction denied her request. A year after Jack's execution, his sister opened the letter he had given her. The 4-page letter, he confessed in detail to the murder of Regina Harrison, providing details only the killer would know. Jack wanted Regina's family to know the truth, claiming her spirit had visited and haunted him for 3 years until he confessed. He described Regina's initial anger and longing for her parents, but said she eventually understood him and forgave him, although he could never forgive himself. He expressed deep remorse and stated he could not rest in peace until Regina's family knew what had happened. Jack instructed his sister to send the letter to the police. In November 2018, she sent it to the Broward police, leading to Regina's body being exhumed and her DNA analyzed, tests that were not possible in the 1980s when the crime occurred. In February 2019, based on the DNA results, the Broward County prosecutor officially announced that Jack was responsible for Regina's death, a crime for which another man had been convicted. In truth, Regina was Jack's first victim, a crime he committed at the age of 18. Regina, a 20-year-old college student, was kind, sweet, and deeply religious, attending Palm Beach Atlantic College, a Christian school in West Palm Beach. On May 12, 1983, Regina left her parents' house for an evening bike ride in the North Beach neighborhood of Hollywood, Florida, but never returned home. Jack spotted her while she was cycling, approached her, and decided to head to the beach. As darkness fell, he kidnapped her, took her to Westlake Park, where he stripped her, assaulted her sexually, and strangled her to death, leaving her body abandoned in the park. The next day, friends and family found Regina's naked body in the woods. During the investigation, witnesses reported seeing Regina riding her bike with a slim, long-haired man on a black bicycle along a popular trail on Hollywood Beach. Authorities created a sketch of the suspect based on the description. For 5 months, there were no leads until Detective John Curcio, previously mentioned, saw a television program about the crime. He was part of the unit that captured Ronald Henry Stewart, a serial sexual assailant who had terrorized women in Florida and Mississippi in the late 1980s. Curcio realized that Ronald matched the suspect's sketch, slim, long-haired, and riding a black bicycle when arrested. A witness who had seen Regina and her alleged attacker at the beach identified Ronald as the man with Regina from a photo lineup. Additionally, an acquaintance of Ronald claimed he had confessed to killing a woman in the park. Soon, Ronald was charged with Regina's murder. Despite several factors suggesting Ronald's innocence, including non-matching fingerprints at the crime scene, he pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He admitted to 3 counts of sexual assault with a deadly weapon in Broward County in exchange for prosecutors dropping charges in 6 other cases. Ronald was sentenced to 50 years in prison in January 1985, to be served concurrently with his other sentences for sexual offenses. He never regretted the plea deal nor claimed any coercion in accepting it. Ronald Henry Stewart served most of his time in Mississippi, but was transferred to Florida in 2007, where he died of cancer the following year. Jack's confession to Regina's murder proved Ronald had no connection to the case. Following this revelation, prosecutor Paula McMahon announced they would work to overturn Ronald's wrongful conviction and investigate Jack's past for other potential victims in Florida and across the U.S. The story of Mary, Lacey, and the Phillips family is a grim reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the most unexpected places. It is also a testament to courage and a demonstration that the pursuit of truth and justice must never waver, as they can emerge when least expected. In the small town of Whitesboro, New York, lived Mary Yoder, vibrant 60-year-old chiropractor who defied her age with her exuberant spirit and meticulous attention to health through exercise and diet, serving as a role model for her patients. She believed firmly in demonstrating that age shouldn't be a barrier to wellness. At her university years, she met her future husband, William Yoder, a fellow chiropractic student. Their mutual passion led to marriage. Together, they embarked on a joint venture, establishing a chiropractic clinic. William, with his methodical and pragmatic approach, managed the business aspects, while Mary, known for her engaging personality, handled patient care, earning their clinic a reputable status. The Yoders were blessed with 3 children, 2 daughters, Leanna and Tamarin, and their cherished son, Adam. By 2015, Adam, 25 years old, was working as a receptionist at the family clinic. His partner, Caitlyn Conley, also employed there, came from a disciplined background as the daughter of a retired military officer. Known for her kindness, intelligence, and love for animals, Caitlyn was a beloved member of the team. However, not all was perfect in the Yoder household. Despite plans for a leisurely retirement traveling across Europe, financial obligations meant continued work for Mary and William. On a fateful Monday, July 20, 2015, Mary's day was packed with appointments. But as the afternoon unfolded, patients began noticing something off about Mary's usual demeanor. Initially presenting with red, swollen eyes, she shrugged it off as a minor flu symptom. However, things escalated when her skin took on a greenish hue, and she began suffering from severe vomiting and diarrhea, leading her to call William for assistance. Upon his arrival, William was shocked to find Mary in a state of apparent shock, a stark contrast to her usually robust health. Despite her condition, Mary initially resisted hospitalization, opting for home remedies and rest. However, by the next morning, her condition had worsened significantly, prompting an urgent visit to the emergency room. There she underwent intense treatment, including IV fluids, to combat her unrelenting symptoms. Despite the efforts of numerous specialists, the cause of her sudden illness remained a mystery, leaving Mary in a state of fear and confusion. On the morning of July 22, Mary had her first cardiac arrest, followed by 7 more. By the afternoon, she couldn't hold on any longer, and she died. This all happened in the blink of an eye. A woman who always looked healthy deteriorated in just 48 hours and died in a hospital in the worst possible condition. This death seemed very suspicious to Mary's relatives because many of them belonged to the medical field. They started thinking in poisoning as an option, so they immediately requested toxicology tests on the body. At first, the doctors were skeptical about the idea because who would want to poison Mary? This only happens in movies. Mary was so careful that she grew part of her food in her garden, like lettuces, so the first doubt was that maybe an insect from there bit her and caused all this. But what kind of insect could do that? The toxicology tests revealed that Mary was indeed poisoned. First, they tested for arsenic and cyanide, which are the most common poisons in these cases. But no, it didn't seem she was poisoned with those. It wasn't until 2 months later that the lab identified what ended Mary's life. It was colchicine. Colchicine is a medication used for gout as it helps to remove uric acid from the joints, which causes this painful inflammation. But if used excessively, it can remove everything from your body. Mary experienced all the visible symptoms of a colchicine overdose, and probably also the invisible ones, like intense burning sensations on the skin and in the throat. This is one of the worst ways to die, and undoubtedly the question now was that it's clear Mary wanted to keep living, so who wanted to end her life? So it seems that someone deliberately poisoned her, especially since dying from this medication requires consuming a large amount. It couldn't have been an accident, and Mary wasn't taking this drug for any medical reason. After the case was declared a homicide, the police began their investigation, and the first suspect, as one might suspect and as often happens in such cases, was her husband, William. This could be yet another story where the victim's partner, driven by jealousy or an affair, becomes the perpetrator. Mary's sisters noticed that William was acting unusually, not appearing genuinely upset or saddened. However, in the absence of concrete evidence and after thorough interrogation, William was released due to insufficient grounds for charges, leaving the investigation at a standstill. Then, in a plot twist reminiscent of a thriller film, an anonymous letter surfaced at the police department. The author claimed to have knowledge of the real perpetrator, Adam Yoder, Sarah's youngest son. The letter didn't just make baseless accusations, it provided potentially damning evidence. It alleged that Adam had poisoned Mary's supplements with colchicine, motivated by a strained relationship and either a desire for inheritance or a twisted plan to gain sympathy and favor in her will. Acting on this tip, the police approached Adam's van without a warrant, but with his consent. To everyone's shock, a search revealed a bottle of colchicine under the passenger seat, along with a receipt bearing Adam's personal details. Stunned and proclaiming innocence, Adam insisted he was being framed. The situation was perplexing for the police as well, given the cinematic nature of the anonymous tip and the fact that Adam had been traveling out of state at the time of Mary's illness, which seemingly ruled out the possibility of him administering the poison. The mystery deepened as it became apparent that only two individuals had been in close proximity to Mary on the day of her illness: William and Caitlyn Conley, Adam's girlfriend. This revelation cast new doubts and opened up further avenues of investigation in a case that seemed to be straight out of a suspense novel. Caitlyn was the only one who had been with Mary throughout that day, but the police did not consider her a suspect initially because there seemed to be no motive for her to do such a thing. Moreover, she appeared to get along well with Mary. After Mary's death, Caitlyn had even dedicated a post expressing her deep sorrow. However, Caitlyn had recently ended her relationship with Adam, and there were a few things about her that didn't quite add up to the police. Thus, they concluded that Caitlyn either knew something nobody else did or she was the guilty party. During the interrogation, Caitlyn began by suggesting that Adam had been acting a bit strange lately. The interrogator, skilled at his job, asked the crucial question whether Caitlyn had recently written an anonymous letter accusing Adam, forgetting to add her name before sending it to the police. Initially, Caitlyn tried to evade the question but ultimately confessed to writing the letter, shifting her status from a witness to a suspect. Now there were three suspects. She claimed that Adam had confessed to her, but her account was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions, likely a result of the immense pressure she was under. Caitlyn also expressed a deep-seated fear of Adam, leading the police to provide her with protection as they delved deeper into the investigation. Crucial piece of evidence emerged when it was discovered that the email address on the colchicine receipt had never been used by Adam. This revelation came from tracking the IP address associated with the email, which led to Caitlyn's home computer and phone. Confronted with this evidence, Caitlyn initially suggested that Adam might have used her devices without her knowledge. However, this theory was weakened when investigators uncovered that not only had the purchase been made through her phone, but her search history also contained incriminating searches about poisons before Mary's death. Furthermore, Caitlyn eventually confessed to buying the prepaid cards used for the purchase. The interrogation reached a climax with the revelation that Caitlyn either acted alone or with an accomplice, as the gathered evidence pointed directly to her involvement. Overwhelmed, Caitlyn broke down, facing the reality of being arrested for the murder of Mary Yoder. Meanwhile, the Yoder family and community were shaken by the unfolding events. Mary's sisters had harbored suspicions about Adam, their reasons anchored in a combination of hearsay and conjecture. Also, neighbors reported seeing William intimately close with one of Mary's sisters prior to her death, fueling rumors of an affair that could have begun before Mary's untimely demise. They also labeled William a fortune hunter, pointing to Mary's role as the main financial provider in the family. The sisters speculated that William, eager for retirement, saw Mary's death as a means to secure his financial future, especially considering a recent inheritance from his father that was insufficient for both of them to retire comfortably. This theory painted William as a man who orchestrated his wife's murder to ensure his own financial stability. At Caitlyn's trial, her defense team pointed fingers at William, suggesting he could have easily tampered with Mary's supplements before leaving the house and had access to the work computer that Caitlyn used. Other defenders accused both William and Adam, On this side were Mary's three sisters, who were so convinced of this theory that they created a website called Free Caitlyn Conley, outlining their reasons for believing William and Adam were the culprits. However, there were doubts about this theory as well. For instance, one of the sisters claimed to have seen William using colchicine in the past, supposedly for his herb cultivation. But when asked when they last saw him doing this, they said it was in the 1980s, casting doubt on their credibility. Now, the origin of the colchicine used in the crime was a critical point of investigation. There were two potential sources. Firstly, it could have been procured from the stock at the Yoder Family Chiropractic Center. Both Mary and Adam were known to sign for deliveries, and the colchicine was used in treatments at the clinic. William could also access the center through his keys, so he could have easily obtained it. However, Caitlyn, as the business administrator who oversaw all materials and financial matters, had even greater access to the clinic's resources. The second possibility was an online purchase. This scenario seemed to implicate Adam due to the receipt details, but also raised suspicions about Caitlyn, particularly since the purchase involved a phone call where the operator recalled speaking with a young woman. Despite this, Mary's sisters insisted that Adam had manipulated not only the police and the judge, but also the operator, a claim that appeared implausible given that the receipt listed Adam, a male, as the purchaser. This web of accusations and counter-accusations added layers of complexity to the case. Regarding the IP addresses that traced back to Caitlyn's devices, there were theories about William's potential involvement. Some speculated that, despite not being tech-savvy, William was intelligent enough to manipulate computers to his advantage. However, this notion was met with skepticism, as basic computer skills do not equate to the expertise required for such deception. On the other hand, Adam, being younger and potentially more tech-literate, might have had the capability to use Caitlyn's devices for the purchases. Yet, the idea that he meticulously orchestrated the crime through Caitlyn's devices, while using his own email with identifiable information for the transaction, and then carelessly left the incriminating receipt in his car, seemed highly improbable. This scenario was likened to a thief meticulously erasing all evidence at a crime scene, only to leave behind a note with their full identity and birth certificate. The intricacies and contradictions within these theories made the investigation exceptionally convoluted and challenging to resolve. As for Caitlyn's involvement, it's hard to discern why she would commit such a crime. Looking at the dynamics between Caitlyn and Adam, they had a toxic relationship with frequent breakups and reconciliations. Adam, known to struggle with alcohol and drug abuse, had been aggressive towards Caitlyn on several occasions, including an allegation of sexual assault in 2014. Adam also had trouble finding stable employment and was not very responsible in his job at the clinic. Before Mary's death, she had started to become stricter about giving him money, adding to the complexity of the relationships within this family. Mary's sisters' contributions were also met with some skepticism. They alleged that following Mary's death, William and Adam were frequently seen together, hinting at possible collusion. However, it's a natural tendency for family members to seek solace in each other's company during times of grief, making this observation not necessarily indicative of guilt. The website created by Mary's sisters, filled with extensive text and purported evidence, didn't automatically lend credence to their theories. The sisters also questioned Adam's innocence because he brought a lawyer to his police interrogation. Unlike Caitlyn, this action, however, could be interpreted as a prudent move, especially considering Adam discovered a purchase of colchicine in his name in his car. The situation was rife with tangled suspicions and accusations, complicating the search for the truth. In legal contexts, having a lawyer present during interrogation is generally advisable. Caitlyn initially faced questioning as a witness before her arrest. Her interrogation raised red flags when she made seemingly incriminating statements, like suggesting that poison is typically a woman's weapon, leading to accusations against her. The investigator countered this by rightly stating that poison could be used by anyone, challenging her line of reasoning. Caitlyn's emotional reactions during interrogation, characterized by expressions of despair and feeling trapped, are often associated with individuals realizing the gravity of their situation, a behavior similar to that exhibited by notable criminal figures. The decision to grant William immunity during the trial raised eyebrows. Granting immunity means he could not be prosecuted for Mary's death, a move that might seem unfair to some. However, immunity carries risks. If the individual is found to be lying, it significantly undermines their credibility and can turn them into a prime suspect. In contrast to Caitlyn's inconsistent responses, both Adam and William presented less contradictory accounts during their interrogations, adding another layer of complexity to an already intricate case. The motives for the murder could vary. Caitlyn was with Mary every day, and Mary was her boss. Hatred towards a boss is a common sentiment, often kept hidden, so Caitlyn's Facebook post mourning Mary doesn't necessarily prove her innocence. Some theorize that Caitlyn committed the crime to reconcile with Adam. Despite his aggressive nature, there's evidence suggesting Caitlyn often sought reconciliation with Adam. After Mary's death, they did get back together for a time, but then separated again. Interestingly, the anonymous letter accusing Adam arrived at the police around the time of their breakup. Determining the guilty party was not easy, and the trial took a long time. Finally, on November 6, 2017, Caitlyn Conley was sentenced to 23 years in prison with the possibility of parole in May 2037. To this day, there are those who believe this was an injustice. If one looks at the case superficially and emotionally, it might seem that William had every motive to commit the crime. But evidence must guide case resolutions. William appears innocent, or at least seems so, because his actions are consistent with his psychological profile of being a serious person, among other things. In complex cases like this, where emotions and suspicions run high, it's the hard evidence that ultimately leads to the resolution. In complex criminal cases, similar to those often featured in true crime narratives, a recurring theme is the presence of high levels of narcissism in the perpetrators, with the notable exception of serial killers and similar profiles. In the trial involving the mysterious death of Mary Yoder, William, her husband, displayed notable attentiveness towards their son Adam, acknowledging the emotional toll the case had taken on him. However, William's involvement with his deceased wife's sister raised eyebrows, marking it as socially inappropriate behavior. Talking about Adam, there were certain aspects of his behavior and history that seemed to indicate a lack of sound judgment. This was inferred from his public interviews, known issues with aggression and alcohol, and a tendency towards impulsive actions. These traits suggested that devising a complex, calculated plan, such as sending an incriminating letter in his own name, was out of character for him. Conversely, Caitlyn's psychological profile appeared to align more closely with the crime's nature. She demonstrated a self-centeredness that fit the typical profile of such perpetrators. Moreover, her intricate involvement in the case, particularly in accusing Adam, raised questions about her methods. Why resort to an anonymous letter and a convoluted scheme instead of directly contacting the police? It seemed likely that she was aware of the insufficient evidence against Adam and thus orchestrated a more elaborate plot. The investigator's observation that criminals often commit offenses under the belief that they won't get caught resonates in this context. Many believe they have devised an infallible plan and consider themselves more clever than others. This overestimation of one's intelligence is a common trait among criminals, but as this case demonstrated, their plans often unravel spectacularly. Hella Bennett was born on April 12, 2002, in Georgia, USA, into a family beset by conflicts. To understand the environment she was born into and lived in during her short life, we must understand her mother, Charity Lee. Her life was fraught with challenges from a young age, marked by tragedy and later struggles with substance abuse and problematic relationships. Charity was born on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, to Killa Clark Bennett and James Robert Bennett, Jr. A defining moment in her childhood occurred when she was just 6 years old. Her father, a 37-year-old trucking company owner, was fatally shot in a violent attack inside their home in an exclusive residential area of Atlanta. He was found with multiple gunshot wounds to his head, chest, and back. The police reported that he was alone at the time of the crime and that there were no signs of struggle at the scene. Initially, authorities suspected organized crime. However, the aftermath of James's funeral brought a shocking development. Charity's mother, Kayla, then 29, became the prime suspect in his murder. The charges were laid just 3 days after the couple, previously divorced, had remarried in Las Vegas. Evidence against Kayla included details like the unlocked doors of their home and her status as the primary heir to the trucking business. Additionally, the patrol officer who transported Kayla post-arrest noted that she occasionally exhibited satisfaction in her demeanor. During the trial, evidence was presented suggesting Kayla had been in contact with a truck driver and might have been involved in a crime. Despite this, the jury found her not guilty due to insufficient evidence, leading to her acquittal. The presiding judge described it as the most peculiar case of his career, given the variety of plausible angles and hypotheses. The controversy surrounding her father's death and her mother's high-profile trial deeply impacted Charity. During her mother's imprisonment, she was cared for by her maternal grandparents. Throughout her childhood and adolescence, Charity sought love and approval from her mother. In a desperate bid for attention, she intentionally turned to drugs, frustrated by her mother's apparent disinterest. At 17, Charity battled depression and heroin addiction, straining her relationship with her mother to the point of being kicked out of the house. With just $100 given by her mother, Charity faced a stark choice between rehabilitation and potential overdose. This money, however, became her lifeline as she chose to enter a rehabilitation center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. She achieved sobriety for about a year, finding a place to live and enrolling in college. Nevertheless, her journey to sobriety was fraught with internal battles against her darkest demons. Nevertheless, during these difficult moments, she attempted to end her life on several occasions. At the age of 18, Charity became pregnant with her first child and at 3 months pregnant, decided she must definitively leave behind that dark stage in her life to become the best mother for her unborn child. That baby, whom she named Paris, became the motivation she needed to recover. She often said that her son had saved her life. When Paris Lee Bennett was born on October 10, 1993, in Abilene, Texas, Charity was alone because the father of the child had left her as soon as he learned of the pregnancy. Later, when Paris was 17 months old, his father returned to their lives. Charity recounted that it was clear the father was not well, having been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. Paris was a very artistic and creative boy who enjoyed drawing. Beginning at the age of 3, he was introverted, not very sociable, and reluctant to show affection to people he knew. The boy, who dreamed of becoming a paleontologist, was focused on his academic life. He studied a lot, had an IQ of 142, and never had problems at school. His performance was much higher than his peers, and his teachers considered him a unique child with potential and a promising future. After having her baby, Charity married twice, but neither union was successful. One marriage was with a man named Brendan, but the circumstances of their breakup were not disclosed. In her desire to form a family, Charity started a relationship with a man named Jonathan, and at the age of 28, she became pregnant with her second child, the daughter. The news filled the family with joy, but initially, Paris did not seem happy about his mother's pregnancy, which worried Charity. However, once his sister was born, things changed. Paris fell in love with his sister, showing affection, protectiveness, and attentiveness towards her. Paris did not have many friends, and his little sister was his playmate. She was a loving, kind, intelligent, and very determined girl. From a young age, she demonstrated a compassionate nature, even expressing a desire for her mother to adopt all of her children in the world. Her loved ones described her as a little girl with a strong personality, always speaking her mind. Over the years, the happy home that Charity dreamed of turned into a nightmare. Her partner had serious alcoholism problems and was a violent man. According to Charity, the relationship ended when her husband was stopped by a police officer, and when asked to exit his vehicle, he refused. The officer reached into the car, and the driver sped off, dragging the officer along. The officer then shot and injured him in the leg. When Charity learned about the incident, she decided she could not allow her children to live in such circumstances, and chose to separate. The young girl enjoyed her relationship with her brother, finding fun and inspiration in playing with him, seeing him as a role model, and wanting to follow in his footsteps. Paris also appeared to enjoy his time with his younger sister. Childhood videos and photographs showed them dancing, playing, and posing together, always smiling. In 2005, Charity and her children moved to Dallas, Texas, to be closer to Kyla, Charity's mother, who had been diagnosed with breast cancer. Charity was a loving mother, but the stress and anxiety from her partner's separation and disputes with her mother led her to relapse into drug use. During the 6 months that Charity was under the influence, Paris took on the role of the protective older brother, a situation that significantly changed his life. He no longer saw his mother as a loving figure, but as an unpleasant woman full of flaws and mistakes. Soon after, the three of them moved to Kyla's ranch in Seymour, Texas, where their lives became even more chaotic. It was during this time that a more emotionally unstable and violent side of Paris began to emerge. He had fits of rage, banging his head against the wall or throwing things on the floor to seek attention. However, Charity seemingly failed to interpret these signs. On one occasion, while living at Kyla's ranch, Paris broke a toy that his sister and a friend were playing with. Seeing this, Charity scolded and punished him. Minutes later, when his mother was away, Paris took a kitchen knife and ran out with it in his hand. Alarmed by the screams of one of the ranch workers, Charity and Kyla rushed to the scene and managed to disarm him after some struggle. Worried about her son and his violent outbursts, Charity took Paris to a psychiatric center. However, feeling that he was not given adequate attention, she decided to return home with her son. According to some accounts, there were other similar episodes later on. On one such occasion, Paris threatened his aunt and sister, leading Charity to take him again to a health center where he underwent various tests. The specialist told Charity that it was concerning for a child so young to have thoughts about harming others, recommending that she seek treatment for him. However, Charity did not take the psychiatrist's suggestions well, finding the evaluation erroneous and offensive, and disregarded the advice. Nonetheless, doubts about how to handle her son's situation lingered in her mind, and shortly after, the family moved to Abilene. Over time, Paris developed resentment towards his mother, leading to constant arguments between them. For Charity, although the changes in her son confused her, she didn't believe they were as serious as the psychologist had suggested. Unfortunately, she was mistaken. Then came February 4, 2007. That day, 13-year-old Paris was visibly upset with his mother from the morning. But as he was a teenager and fights between mother and son had become a daily occurrence, she didn't give it much thought. At that time, Charity was working at a well-known restaurant near Abilene and had hired a babysitter that day to help while she was at work. She thought she had faced worse things with Paris, and that, as in the past, everything would be resolved. So before leaving, she approached her son, kissed him, and told him she loved him. She had a demanding workday due to the Super Bowl. After midnight, around 12:30 a.m. on February 5, 2007, exhausted from the intense hours, Charity was cleaning tables at the restaurant, eager to finish her shift and return home to rest and see her children. That's when several police officers arrived at the establishment. As she went to find the manager, she heard her name mentioned in the office and felt terror. Confused and disoriented, she couldn't understand what was happening when an officer told her that her 4-year-old daughter was injured. Her immediate reaction was to ask what had happened and where her daughter was. Then, the officer informed her that her daughter had passed away. Unable to bear the shock, Charity fainted. There is nothing more terrifying for a mother than the death of a child. But the truth she heard from the police was much crueler and more painful than she could have imagined. While being taken by the police to the station, Charity asked about her son Paris, and an officer responded that they had him. This brief and stark answer made her realize her worst nightmare had come true. When she heard her daughter had died, she felt shattered. But learning that Paris was the perpetrator was like having those shattered pieces broken again. According to the police investigation, that night the babysitter had taken the kids out for Chinese food. They returned home and watched a children's movie. The little girl then went to her room to sleep, while Paris retreated to his because he had to finish his homework. It's unknown at what moment Paris decided to end his sister's life, but as a bright and manipulative teenager, around 10 at night, he managed to convince the babysitter she could go home, assuring her that his mother was on her way. With her absence, it would be easier for him to execute his plan. What happened once they were alone was a true scene of terror. Paris went to Ella's room, beat her, sexually abused the little girl, barely 4 years old, and suffocated her. Then, with a knife he had taken from the kitchen, he gave her 17 fatal stabs. Immediately after the attack, Paris picked up the phone and called a friend, engaging in a conversation about various topics. Roughly 2 minutes after ending this call, which lasted 6 minutes at 11:42 p.m., the teenager dialed 911. During the call with the emergency operator, Paris seemed desperate and distressed about the atrocious act he had just committed. When asked if the girl was bleeding, he admitted she was because he had inflicted several wounds on her. The operator instructed Paris to perform CPR while waiting for emergency services and provided the necessary directions. On the recording, Paris can be heard counting as if following the instructions, but investigators later concluded that he never attempted to revive her. This was deduced from the position of the little girl's body and the blood-stain patterns found at the scene. In an attempt to justify his actions, Paris told the operator that he had hallucinated and thought his little sister was a demon. Soon, the street outside was filled with police and paramedics. Paris was taken into custody and brought to the police station while the investigation began at their home. During interrogation, he again mentioned his demonic hallucinations, claiming he was sleeping with his sister and woke up to her face looking different, like a demon engulfed in flames. He said he thought she was possessed and attacked her in a panic attack. As Paris continued his account, however, he fell into contradictions. He mentioned feeling resentment towards his sister since her birth because he was no longer the center of attention. Initially, investigators thought jealousy might have motivated the attack, But then he revealed his original plan also included killing his mother when she returned home. After a long, confusing, and painful night, Charity arrived at the police station to see her son. The inconsolable mother was shattered but became emotional upon seeing Paris. She got up, hugged, and caressed him amid tears, showing him she was there for him. Paris's reaction, in contrast, was cold and emotionless. He simply sat and coldly asked her what she planned to do. When Charity broke down in tears asking what he meant, Paris reminded her that she had always said she could take someone's life if they harmed her children. His question was not out of fear, but rather a challenge. At that moment, Charity realized there was something very dark in her son. Following his arrest, Paris was charged with the murder but not tried as an adult, as the minimum age for adult prosecution in Texas is 14 years. Instead, he was charged in juvenile court and pleaded guilty to capital murder. Charity was left feeling confused and unsure of what to do next. Although Paris's defense team suggested he not plead guilty for Charity, this was unthinkable. She couldn't hate her son and wanted him to be held accountable for his actions, yet she also desperately sought to understand what had driven him to such extremes. While the prosecution aimed for a life sentence, his lawyer was preparing to secure the lightest sentence possible. As part of their efforts, the defense advised against Charity receiving mental health counseling, fearing that the prosecution might use the reports against Paris. Despite the traumatic ordeal she faced as the mother of both the victim and the perpetrator, she finally accessed counseling 2 years after the crime. She was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and depressive disorders. Charity lost 15 kilograms in 13 days, started self-harming, and harbored a strong desire to die. Nevertheless, she knew she had to be strong for Paris, whom she never stopped loving despite the circumstances. In the months following, Paris was in complete isolation. He didn't speak and communicated only through letters and drawings. 2 months before his sentencing, Paris began to reject simple instructions and became more violent. On one occasion, he repeatedly hit a fellow inmate in the face and received a warning for making derogatory comments about other inmates. He later flooded his cell and confronted guards who came to see what was happening. During evaluations, he referred to the crime against his sister with a smile on his face. Prison staff reported that Paris repeatedly tried to manipulate them into giving him his mother's address. At one point, Texas Department of Justice officials said he had hacked the jail's computer system, though the intent was unclear. During this time, 2 psychologists evaluated Paris, and a third reviewed the case. Each report described the boy as showing marked antisocial behavior, reduced empathy, and remorse. The first specialist wrote that he had a moderate risk of developing traits characteristic of psychopathy and pathological narcissism. The second asserted that the teenager displayed all the characteristics of a psychopath. The third went further, suggesting to Charity that she change her identity and move somewhere Paris could never find her. Paris was sentenced to 40 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, which is the maximum sentence for capital murder in a Texas juvenile court. Had he been an adult, he would have faced the death penalty. Paris will be eligible for parole for the first time in February 2027. If he is never granted parole, he will be released in February 2047, by which time he will be over 50 years old. 2 years after his sentencing, Paris made chilling and macabre confessions about his motivations. He revealed that his original plan was to take the life of his mother, Charity, but after much thought, he realized he wanted to make her suffer in a way that killing her would not achieve. By taking away her young daughter, Ella, he knew Charity would suffer for the rest of her life. In 2013, 6 years after losing Ella, Charity became pregnant and decided to raise her new baby, Phoenix, on her own, despite still being devastated by the loss of her beloved Ella. Phoenix brought life, joy, and a renewed will to move forward back into her life. However, Phoenix's arrival was not without challenges. He was born with a defective heart valve and had to undergo open-heart surgery. Fortunately, he recovered successfully. When Paris learned of his mother's pregnancy, he sent her a letter expressing his happiness, even though he knew he would never be able to meet his half-brother in person due to legal restrictions preventing convicted felons from contacting minors under 17 years of age. This restriction was a relief for Charity, who never brought Phoenix to the prison. Although Paris and Phoenix never met in person, they talked over the phone when Charity called her eldest son. Despite trying to handle these interactions naturally, Charity always harbored the fear of doing something that might put Phoenix in danger from his brother. In 2013, at the age of 19, Paris was transferred to an adult prison. 6 years later, in 2019, he gained significant attention after an interview with journalist Piers Morgan. In the interview, a calm 26-year-old Paris claimed he never felt he achieved any goal by killing his sister. He expressed being completely different from the person he was at the time of the murder and acknowledged the deep hatred he once felt for his mother, though he admitted to harboring thoughts of committing a crime since he was very young. Paris' story inspired documentaries revealing his manipulative and narcissistic personality. However, he consistently insisted that he was not mentally ill. For a long time, Charity visited and communicated with Paris through letters and phone calls. She shared her story with various media outlets, explaining that after her daughter's death, nothing made sense anymore, marking the end of the life she knew. Reflecting on the past, she regretted relapsing into drug use, believing it injured Paris, but she did not regret how she raised him. In 2021, Charity declared that she had ceased all communication with Paris. This decision came after learning he had become involved with a woman on bail living 2 hours from her home. Charity acknowledged that while she still loved Paris as her son, she did not like the man he had become. Following the tragedy, Charity established a foundation named Ella in honor of her daughter, which also stands for empathy, love, lessons, and action in English. Through this initiative, she advises families of both victims of violent crimes and offenders. Having experienced both sides of such tragedies, first as a child when her mother was accused of her father's murder, and later as a mother when Paris committed his crime, Charity understands the profound impact violent crimes have on families. She feels that the best way to honor her daughter, Ella, is by helping others navigate adversity, regardless of which side of the story they are on. This foundation serves as a testament to her commitment to supporting those affected by violent crimes and creating a platform for healing and understanding. Charity's work aims to provide guidance and support to those facing similar challenges, helping them to find a path forward amidst the turmoil and pain caused by such life-altering events. After 13 years working, Charity decided to shut down the Ella Foundation to focus on her son, Phoenix. Vicky Glass was born on September 21, 1979, in Stockton-on-Tees, a trading town situated on the banks of the River Tees. At that time, it was part of the extinct county of Cleveland, later reassigned the county of Durham in England. She was the daughter of Deborah and Anthony Glass and had an older sister named Claire, who was a year older than her. Vicky entered the world prematurely, weighing less than 3.3 pounds, and both her life and her mother's were in danger. Eventually, Vicky's parents separated, and when she was 6 years old, her mother remarried Colin Goodall, a man also living in Stockton-on-Tees. This new union gave the young girl an additional stepsister named Cheryl, who was older than her, and a younger brother named Thomas. From that point on, Vicky lived with them. Vicky had light skin, light brown eyes, and long hair, a look she maintained from childhood into adolescence when she decided to cut her hair. Despite being born with a hearing impairment, music was Vicky's passion, and she considered herself a huge fan of Michael Jackson. Her musical inclination led her to join the local jazz band at a very young age. Clearly, she was a determined young lady. She remained with the group from the ages of 13 to 18, during which time she always enjoyed the trips they took to perform in various places. According to her acquaintances, she felt proud when she performed. Vicky also had a deep love for animals, particularly cats. In fact, she rescued one which she named Sooty. Vicky attended Blakestone High School, also located in Stockton-on-Tees, and had a keen interest in running and sports in general. However, she was very diligent and never neglected her studies. Later on, she secured a job at a local factory in Teesside. While some people who knew her saw Vicky as a quiet and somewhat shy girl, her family and closest friends knew her to be very cheerful. They said she had a heart of gold and was very affectionate. She was indeed a much-loved person who seemingly had everything and lived in a healthy and happy environment. Unfortunately, her life took a dramatic turn when she was nearing her 18th birthday. According to her mother, she began associating with the wrong crowd and started using drugs. The young woman became addicted to heroin and became so dependent on narcotics that she started offering sex services to support her addiction, eventually leading her to leave her home. Over time, Vicky began frequenting the suburbs of Middlesbrough, about 8 kilometers to the east of Stockton-on-Tees, particularly a truck parking lot where transport companies used to park their vehicles overnight. By December 1999, Vicky had developed a chest condition and was homeless. Through a friend, she met a man who lived in Middlesbrough, who offered her shelter while she recovered her health. The homeowner took care of her, and the place became her permanent residence. He assisted her in scheduling her medical appointments and ensured she didn't miss them. Despite the man's efforts to help the girl heal and improve her life, she continued with her addiction to illegal substances and continued offering her services as a sex worker. In the year 2000, Vicky continued with the same lifestyle, and so her 21st birthday arrived on September 21. Unfortunately, the joy quickly turned into tragedy. According to case reports, on that Thursday night, the young woman worked and also celebrated. Apparently, Friday, the 22nd, passed without incident, and by Saturday, the 23rd, Vicky went to her home in the company of a friend to change clothes. Around noon, both of them left the place. Hours later, past midnight, Vicky met with a client on Borough Road, located in the center of Middlesbrough. They then went to 104 Princes Road, a place frequented by drug users and sex workers. She was dressed in a white shirt, light gray pants, and white sneakers. Some time later, the young woman and her client took a taxi down on Union Street and went back to this male's home in Norton, Stockton. After spending some time there, Vicky called a taxi line she often used. The driver picked her up at around 4 a.m. on Sunday, September 24, and about 20 minutes later, he dropped her off in Middlesbrough, specifically at the junction of Union Street and Eshwood Square. This is just to the rear on a pub that was then called the Shipmate. As soon as the taxi driver dropped the woman off at the designated destination, he returned to the headquarters of the taxi company he worked for. That night, and in the following days, Vicky did not return to her house. Her friend, the man who had helped her when she needed it most, became worried as her absence prolonged. He started asking about her at all the places she frequented. Since no one could provide information about her whereabouts, he decided to contact the police to report her as missing. In the same month, a man named Sean Tooley was arrested. His arrest was related to the asphyxiation death of a 20-year-old woman named Kelly Mallinson, who also engaged in sex work to finance her addiction and frequented the same places Vicky did. Tooley was sentenced to life in prison a year later. On Friday, November 3, 6 weeks after Vicky's disappearance, a man who was walking dogs made a gruesome discovery on a trail in the town of Danby, a picturesque village located in the North Yorkshire. Around 6 in the morning, the man came across the naked and decomposed corpse of a woman. Immediately, amidst his shock, the citizen notified the police. The remains were taken to the coroner's office, where experts determined that it was Vicky. Due to the state of the remains, pathologists concluded that she had been exposed to the moorland winds for several weeks. Although they couldn't establish the cause of her death, they stated that there appeared to be no wounds and no signs of abuse, sexual or otherwise, nor any indication that she had died from drowning. Officials who arrived at the scene searched the area surrounding where Vicky's body was found for clues and tried to locate the victim's clothing, but their efforts yielded no results. Cleveland and North Yorkshire police officers initiated investigations. A team of 40 officers tried to reconstruct the unfortunate young woman's last steps during the night of September 23 and the early hours of September 24. They interviewed both the taxi driver and the employees of the places Vicky frequented, as well as the friend who had given her shelter and some witnesses and colleagues. Sergeant Brian Dunn, who was leading the investigation at that time, made several public appeals for assistance from the community. They needed someone to provide information that could be useful in catching the perpetrator. Vicky's family was devastated by the tragic death of the young woman. On that day, when her mother returned from work, the police were at her house. Her initial reaction was to ask if they had found her daughter and if she was okay, but when she received the news, she began to tremble. Until that moment, she was convinced that her daughter would reappear alive, and every contact she had with the police involved asking if they would help Vicky get off drugs once they found her. On November 13, Vicky's mother, Deborah, lashed out at the press for labeling her daughter as a drug addict. She emphasized that this fact was irrelevant and that the important thing was that she was a 21-year-old girl who had lost her life in a brutal manner. The following week, posters with Vicky's photograph were placed in various locations, especially in the places where the girl had been on the night she disappeared. In that same month of November, the police reported that they had spoken to more than 500 people and had taken statements from 150, including former clients of the young woman, taxi drivers, neighbors, and truck drivers. They also analyzed over 60 hours of closed-circuit camera recordings located in the areas the victim used to frequent. November was passing when Vicky's father, Anthony, and her stepfather, Colin, went together to the site where the lifeless body of the girl was found. On that day, Deborah's absence was notable, but the mother was too affected to participate in the ceremony. In addition to placing flowers, they prayed for any clues or information that would lead to the truth about what had happened. Anthony sent a plea to members of the community to help them find closure. In doing so, he stressed that they only needed a phone call to end the nightmare they were living, not knowing what had happened to their daughter. The investigation focused on the hundreds of truck drivers who used to frequent the parking lot in Middlesbrough. As part of the inquiries, a 39-year-old married man was arrested, but his identity was never revealed. Eventually, his connection to the case was ruled out, and he was released. In January 2002, the investigators in charge of the case arrested a 47-year-old unmarried man, identified as Eric Coates, who resided in North Yorkshire. This was the third time officials had interviewed him in relation to the case, as he had been unable to provide a credible alibi for his whereabouts on the day Vicky disappeared. The agents found it suspicious that he couldn't remember certain details precisely. The man admitted that he had been with sex workers, but denied any involvement in Vicky's death. He also revealed that 1 or 2 girls had mentioned to him that the crime was related to a drug debt settlement. His house, which he shared with his parents, was searched by the police, as were other properties belonging to his family. During the searches, officers seized computer equipment, clothing, diaries, videotapes, and a vehicle. Additionally, this individual had a criminal record. He had been arrested and imprisoned for 15 months in 1994 for unlawfully restraining and assaulting a sex worker in Middlesbrough. However, he was acquitted of charges of attempted sexual assault and indecent assault against the same woman. Ultimately, it was determined that Eric had nothing to do with Vicky's crime, and he was released. His father, a former county councillor in North Yorkshire, stated that they were as interested as the police in finding out who had taken the young woman's life. Years later, in 2006, Eric was imprisoned and sentenced to 14 years for pleading guilty to 15 sexual offenses against girls aged between 11 and 14 years. In this context, it was also revealed that his father had faced 12 charges of sexual offenses, but was not brought to trial due to health reasons. Returning to 2002, in July, Cleveland police questioned a man identified as John Taylor, who was serving a life sentence after pleading guilty to the kidnapping and murder of a 16-year-old girl in Leeds, West Yorkshire. The investigations into Jean also yielded no results, and he was ruled out as a suspect in the attack on Vicky. In December 2006, detectives from Cleveland Police reported that they had contacted their colleagues in Suffolk to explore possible connections between Vicky's case and the tragic deaths of 5 other sex workers. For these crimes, truck driver Steve Wright had been arrested, and 2 years later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Subsequently, the authorities in Cleveland ruled out any connection of the man with the death. When the tragedy reached its 10-year mark, Vicky's parents visited the place where their daughter was found lifeless and placed flowers in her honor. Deborah told reporters that she thought of her daughter every day and that it was a pain that would never go away. In December 2010, the case file was once again examined, searching for possible links, such as a man identified as Stephen Griffiths, who had taken the lives of 3 sex workers in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, at the beginning of January 2011, any possible connection to Vicky's disappearance was ruled out. For the family, the pain of loss was compounded by the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to her and the belief that the person responsible for her death remained at large. Vicky's grandmother, who was very close to the girl, was deeply affected and passed away a year later. Her mother, Deborah, passed away in 2015 at the age of 55 without ever getting to know the person who took her daughter's life. Anthony later admitted that during the first 24 months after the tragedy, he couldn't work and lost his job. He confessed that he couldn't smile, and it took him a long time to regain belief in himself and convince himself that it wasn't his fault. In 2017, the Cleveland Police requested a grant to fund 3 separate historic cases in the vicinity of Middlesbrough. A year later, the Home Office agreed to provide approximately £3.7 million, about $4.6 million at the current exchange rate, to fund the Historic Investigation Unit aimed at thoroughly reviewing unsolved cases. In addition to Vicky's case, officials also reopened the cases of Donna Keogh, who disappeared in 1998 at the age of 17, and Rachel Wilson, who disappeared in 2002, with her body being located in a ditch 10 years later. There were some similarities in these cases, such as the age and occupation of the victims, and the fact that all 3 occurred in Middlesbrough. In October 2018, a website published information that rekindled hopes of uncovering the truth about Vicky's death. The news referred to a high-profile convicted offender. The inmate had been a taxi driver and was responsible for ending the life of a 22-year-old office worker who went missing in March 2011, and her remains were found in a grave. According to the media report, at the time of his arrest, the man confessed to the murder of another young woman, age 20, committed 8 years earlier, and he provided information about the location of the body. However, no connection between the criminal and Vicky's case could be established. In September 2021, the police announced that they had significant new lines of investigation regarding the unsolved case. In this context, they made a fresh public appeal, urging anyone who knew any details about what might have happened to Vicky in 2000 to contact the authorities. The officers expressed hope because they now had more modern forensic techniques and plans to interview potential witnesses and examine over 2,000 hours of CCTV footage. During this time, one of the detectives on the case mentioned that in the preceding 12 months, a lot of work had been done on Vicky's case. He explained that a detailed review of the original investigation had resulted in 300 recommendations, with the primary one being to initiate a new investigation, leveraging advancements in forensic science. In the same year, the case of Rachel, mentioned earlier, was closed with the arrest of a 62-year-old man identified as Keith Hall, who was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 2022, the investigators leading the case appealed to the community to collaborate by providing any information that could be helpful in solving the mystery surrounding Vicky's death. They were particularly interested in identifying the truck driver who was seen with the young woman hours before her disappearance. To achieve this goal, they released CCTV images in which Vicky is seen walking with a man in a parking lot on the night of her disappearance. And later, she is seen conversing with a truck driver to whom she may have left some of her belongings. This latter man was described as an individual with white skin, broad shoulders, aged between 34 and 38, and having a distinctive mark on his face. The police also launched a website with Vicky's name in an effort to gather information about the case. As part of these initiatives, detectives spoke with hundreds of people, and while they collected a significant amount of information, the identity of the truck driver remains unknown. That year, the family issued a statement reaffirming their deep love for Vicky and the difficult times they were going through. They emphasized that Deborah, Vicky's mother, passed away without answers, knowing that the person who took her daughter's life was still on the streets. On November 3, 2023, 23 years had passed since Vicky's lifeless body was found, and the investigation to find the person responsible for her death is one of the most extensive in the history of Cleveland police in England. Each year that goes by without justice is another year of suffering for the relatives of Vicky Glass, who would be 44 years old today. The police stated that in order to provide closure to the family, they need the support of the community. They are confident that someone out there possesses the missing piece to solve the puzzle and expressly called on that person to come forward to the authorities to help uncover the truth. Rosana Gallano was having dinner with her sister Monica in the living room of her house in El Remanso Exaltación de la Cruz when her phone rang. It was her husband, Jose Arts, calling to say he was running late to pick up their sons, Geronimo and Nehuen, ages 4 and 3. Rosana answered the call, but, struggling to hear, stepped out into the garden to talk. As she tried to communicate with Jose, a figure emerged from the trees, took a few steps toward her, and pulled out a gun. The assailant fired 6 shots, leaving 29-year-old Rosana's body just steps from her home, struck by 4 bullets. Rosana Gallano was born in the late 1970s in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She was the youngest child, with 2 brothers named Oscar and Gustavo, and a sister named Monica. Her parents were Reynaldo and Graciela. The details of her childhood and teenage years are a bit of a mystery, but it's known that she finished high school in the late 90s. During this time, Rosana's dad, Reynaldo, worked as a mechanic. Early in 2001, Jose Arts showed up at Reynaldo's workshop. Jose was born on November 22, 1948. He had lived abroad for over 30 years, in places like Greece and the United States, where he even spent 4 years in prison for drug trafficking. Eventually, Jose returned to Argentina in 1996, owning 8 properties in a posh area of Buenos Aires. Jose and Rosana met when he brought his vintage car for repairs at her father's shop. Despite the significant age difference, they started dating quickly. At that time, Rosana was unemployed and quite reserved. Jose appeared to be financially stable, but in reality, his wealth came from his mother, Elsa, who was still in the United States. When Jose, at the age of 52, proposed to 22-year-old Rosana, her mother Graciela questioned if he was too old for her daughter. Jose argued that love knew no age. Looking for assurance, Graciela turned to Rosana, who, in a whisper, confirmed her desire to marry him. The couple got married on November 17, 2001, after just 7 months of dating. Jose claimed that his cheerful, modern, and smart personality won Rosana over. Soon after, they had a son named Geronimo. But not long after, problems began to show. Jose was a controlling and jealous man who often belittled Rosana and her family. This abuse eventually became physical, leaving Rosana feeling trapped and fearful. Jose's intimidating presence, reinforced by owning 2 guns, ensured he kept control, a situation that Rosana's family was painfully aware of. It was common for Jose to show off his guns, either when someone visited their home or when he was out visiting others. One time, while painting their house, Rosana's brother Oscar witnessed Jose physically assaulting her, telling her to shut up before hitting her. On another occasion, her father noticed bruises on Rosana's back, and she simply told him that Jose had dragged her across the pavement. Despite these troubles, Rosana and Jose welcomed their second child, and Rosana tried her best to make the relationship work, hoping to provide a stable home for their children. However, her efforts were constantly undermined by Jose's temper and disrespectful behavior. To make matters worse, Jose's mother, Elsa, controlled the household from afar, making decisions about their lives during her short visits to Argentina. By 2006, Rosana had endured unbearable abuse and finally reported Jose for domestic violence. Her family was largely unaware of the full extent of her suffering. Months later, Rosana filed a second complaint, including a request for a medical examination due to her injuries. Following this, she opened up to her sister Monica, and they made a pact to communicate whenever something happened. Monica became her sanctuary and support. Whenever life with Jose became unbearable, Rosana would visit Monica's apartment with her children, though Jose dictated when they must return, often with death threats. At times, he verbally abused Rosana, criticizing her abilities as a mother. Eventually, she decided to move in with Monica and the children, while Jose stayed at his house. After some time, Rosana filed another complaint and sought a divorce, resulting in a restraining order against Jose. They only met at a neutral property in El Remanso, Exaltación de la Cruz, for child visitation, as arranged by the court. It was there that Rosana shared the extent of her ordeal with the gardener. Daniel Gonzalez, who lived nearby, was married and had a daughter. Rumors suggested a secret romance between Rosana and Daniel, but this was never confirmed. Jose's threats continued, and Rosana even played a voicemail for her brother Oscar in which Jose talked about killing her. In mid-2007, while hanging out with friends at a bar, Rosana met Oscar Lugo. He was 32, lived in Marino, and worked in a sewing workshop. They hit it off immediately, exchanged numbers, and started dating. Oscar Lugo was old-fashioned, a gentleman who was kind, attentive, and listened to her. For 29-year-old Rosana, who had been through endless turmoil, it felt like she was rediscovering a nearly forgotten life. Oscar Lugo noticed Rosana's lack of confidence and the fear in her. By December 2007, he had joined her for the holiday festivities, even dressing up as Santa Claus to delight her sons. But the happiness was marred by Jose, who kept tabs on Rosana's every move. Aware of her new relationship and panicked by the looming divorce, Jose called Rosana, offering her a truck to end things with Oscar Lugo. She refused, and it was her new boyfriend who accompanied her to the hospital during a severe nervous breakdown. Out of options, Jose hatched a plan, financed by his mother, Elsa. They meticulously arranged to hire a hitman whose identity remains a mystery. On January 16, 2008, Rosana and her sister Monica went to El Remanso to pick up her sons, age 4 and 3. The handover was delayed by Jose with excuses. At 9:15 p.m., Jose called, claiming Geronimo had a fever and he would take him to the hospital and return him the next day. However, Rosana insisted on having the children back to care for Geronimo herself. The call was brief, and then she went inside. Around 9:53 p.m., Rosana texted Oscar Lugo with a casual message about their plans for the next day. At 10 p.m., Rosana and Monica sat down for dinner. At 10:50 p.m., Jose called again, and this conversation turned into a deadly trap. Rosana went out to the garden for better reception, where a shadowy figure emerged from behind the trees and shot her 4 times with a .45 caliber gun. Hearing the shots, Monica screamed, saw Rosana stagger and collapse. Frantic, Monica tried calling 911 without success, then asked her boyfriend to alert the police. Meanwhile, Oscar Lugo, unaware of the events, tried contacting Rosana at 11 p.m. and failing that, tried to reach Monica but got no response. Police investigations revealed that the shooter had entered from an adjacent vacant lot. A witness saw someone fleeing through a gap in the fence but couldn't provide a clear description due to the darkness. That night, Jose was questioned and appeared shocked. After requesting a lawyer, he let the lawyer handle the proceedings and left. The next day, during further searches, a red sweater was found, which Rosana's relatives believed belonged to Jose, making him the prime suspect in their eyes. The case grabbed media attention and shocked the country, becoming scandalous as Jose and his mother publicly claimed his innocence and talked bad about Rosana, suggesting she had multiple lovers and those men should be investigated instead. After the incident, Daniel, the gardener, became reclusive, speaking to no one. On the night of Rosana's funeral, Reynaldo noticed Jose nearby in a truck, watching from a distance without joining or expressing condolences. Jose's defense later targeted Monica, Rosana's sister and the sole witness, raising doubts about her by questioning why there were no bloodstains on her clothes and why she ran for her phone instead of helping her sister. However, this theory was unsupported. The investigators argued the weapon was too heavy for a woman to manage. An important point raised by the detectives was that anyone familiar with the house would know Rosana needed to go outside to get a cell signal, indicating significant premeditation in the crime. During the investigation, Rosana's sons were cared for by their father and grandmother Elsa, while their grandmother Graciela could see them. However, Monica and Oscar were denied access, with Jose claiming serious safety concerns for his sons. Despite the legal restrictions, the children expressed a desire to see their Aunt Monica, leading Jose to occasionally allow visits. Monica used these opportunities to take them to a psychologist. Eventually, Graciela obtained visitation rights, though not guardianship. In an interview at the time, Jose alleged that Rosana had 4 lovers, all with legal troubles. According to Jose, Rosana was intimate with these men to uncover their secrets, which she then used to blackmail them for benefits. Meanwhile, after receiving threats, Oscar was made a protected witness in his sister's case, requiring him to wear a tracking bracelet and being assigned police protection. As 2007 was ending, the investigators had yet to find solid evidence to charge any of the suspects. However, a significant turn came a year after the murder when Jose was arrested in January 2008, charged with aggravated homicide due to their relationship, premeditation, and the involvement of 2 or more people. The preliminary hearings began on January 28, 2008. Reynaldo, Graciela, Monica, and Oscar testified about Jose's repeated threats, violent nature, and use of firearms for intimidation. The mother also presented the last text messages from her daughter to the prosecutor. After the hearing, Reynaldo expressed feeling a heavy burden but found relief in fulfilling his duty to his daughter's memory. The next day, Oscar Lugo, Rosana's former boyfriend, testified against Jose, describing him similarly to the family's view. He mentioned Jose's attempts to tarnish his and Rosana's reputations, adding that Rosana believed Jose's claims of her having multiple lovers were a tactic to discredit her in their impending divorce. Jose's lawyer downplayed the allegations of Jose's emotional instability and aggression, suggesting they were echoing Rosana's narrative. On February 7, 2008, a 12-hour investigative session took place, with Jose's mother traveling from the United States for her turn to testify. Meanwhile, a new search at El Remanso yielded no new evidence. By then, Rosana's family suspected her mother-in-law's involvement in the plot. As a result, Reynaldo and Graciela's lawyer considered requesting her arrest. In defense, Jose and his mother's lawyer argued that Jose's mother had stated in her testimony that she bought houses for her grandchildren, believing the divorce settlement would not harm them. It was also added that it was untrue that Jose's mother and Rosana had a bad relationship. The media continued to debate the circumstances of Rosana's death and the notion that Jose orchestrated the murder, hinting at another perpetrator. Despite the suspicions, Jose was released on bail and took care of his children. Later, the court deemed the police protection for Oscar, Rosana's brother who worked as a taxi driver, unnecessary. On the early morning of July 5, 2008, Oscar was attacked by 2 armed men. They beat and threatened him for an hour before abandoning him in a vacant lot, where he was found thanks to his protective witness tracking bracelet. Though not severely injured, he was deeply shaken. Amidst the grief of losing Rosana and the ongoing custody battle, the family faced renewed fear, a fear that was palpable and justified. With no one convicted and ongoing threats, the demand for justice grew more urgent, yet the judicial system's slow pace was disheartening. Years passed, and by 2012, the trial and custody dispute dragged on. 4 years after the attack, Oscar used his visitation rights to take his nephews to play soccer, sharing a memorable hug with the 6- and 7-year-old boys. In April 2013, the oral trial started. Jose maintained his innocence. In May, proceedings were delayed when Jose suffered a stroke, pushing the final verdict to November 2013. The judges found that the murder was meticulously planned, resembling organized crime. Jose and Elsa were implicated in choosing the time and place for the attack, knowing that a phone call would lure Rosana outside, making her vulnerable. The court found financial motives behind the murder, as Jose did not want to split the marital assets. Jose and Elsa were sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction was upheld by the higher court, highlighting Jose's threats, the domestic violence endured by Rosana, and the dominant influence of his mother. The actual shooters were never identified. In 2015, Jose and Elsa received house arrest, Jose due to his health and Elsa due to her age, allowing the kids to live with them again. The media continued to cover the children's story for years, during which time Monica and Graciela had no contact with them. The boys shuffled between homes known to their father but strangers to Rosana's family. In the second week of January 2017, the court allowed the children to spend a weekend with their maternal grandparents for the first time. The Gallano family prepared their home with fresh paint, a thorough cleaning and decorations. They hung balloons and made a colorful welcome sign. Graciela prepared their favorite dish. That weekend, the Gallano home was filled with joy as the boys played soccer, video games, and even asked to sleep in their grandmother's bed, whom they hadn't seen in over 2 years. On November 24, 2018, Jose died after another stroke. The event was another blow for the children, who attended their father's funeral. During the funeral, they expressed their concern about their future with their Aunt Monica. She assured them with calmness and love, promising to support whatever they decided. They chose to live with Monica, who then had to confront Elsa to communicate the boys' decision. Through these and many other instances, it was clear that Monica always acted in alignment with her nephew's wishes, whether they wanted to talk or preferred silence. Monica's primary goal was to provide stability and comfort for the boys. In March 2019, Geronimo chose not to change schools since he was close to his friends and had 2 years left there, so he went back to live with his grandmother Elsa. Meanwhile, Monica sought custody of the other kid. Things seemed to be stabilizing, but in the last week of November 2019, 87-year-old Elsa was moved from her home to the hospital, where she passed away on November 30th. The following month, Monica was granted custody of Nehuen. By year's end, Geronimo moved in with a friend of his grandmother. Both brothers continued to need psychological support to process their experiences, with Geronimo struggling with depression. Their psychologist noted the overwhelming succession of events they faced. In March 2020, just before pandemic restrictions started, the person Geronimo was living with passed away, leading him to seek refuge with his Aunt Monica until October 2020. Upon turning 18, Geronimo rented a small apartment and lived independently, supported by income from his inherited properties. Monica began legal proceedings to secure their inheritance, fearing they might be deprived of their assets. Nehuen, meanwhile, showed emotional stability thanks to the support he received and was encouraged to return to therapy whenever needed. Cara Nichols faced her share of struggles, turning to drugs during her high school years and grappling with addiction well into her adult life. She started working as an escort at 17, but didn't give up on her dreams and sought a modeling career as she grew older. On October 9th, Cara mentioned to her roommates that she was off to Denver for a modeling gig and then vanished, sparking a trail of leads that ultimately led nowhere. For a time, The police even had an unidentified woman in their sights as a possible link to the disappearance. Over the years, there were supposed sightings of Cara, but none held up under scrutiny. However, the breakthrough in this perplexing case would come from the most unexpected source. Cara Nichols was born on May 20, 1993. Her dad, Paul Nichols, was a businessman. Her mom, Julia Nichols, kept her job out of the public eye. Though there's no official record, it seems Cara was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. She had an older brother named Terrence, who everyone called Terry, and a younger sister whose name has been kept private. Cara was the middle child, and her parents saw her as the heart of their family. But that wasn't the only reason everyone gravitated toward her. She had this unique charm and personality that made people love being around her. Cara was outgoing, full of life, and super creative. She had a magnetic and sweet nature, making her someone you just couldn't help but like. Even her teachers were fond of her. One of them felt lucky to have taught her, noting Cara's incredible potential from a young age. Growing up, Cara was a happy kid, but adolescence brought its challenges. At 13, she got caught shoplifting and had to do community service. During her sophomore year in high school, she struggled with severe depression after the family dog died. Despite her parents' efforts to get her counseling, Cara resisted and even refused medication. The exact cause of her emotional struggle remains unclear, whether it was due to lack of professional support or some unspoken traumatic event. During this tough time, Cara began using illegal substances, eventually turning to hard drugs like heroin, which led to more problems. She started high school in Colorado Springs, where she lived with her brother Terry. But due to her addiction issues, she transferred to a more alternative school where she could graduate at her own pace. From a young age, Cara was drawn to the fashion world, especially modeling and makeup. After high school, she was determined to chase her dreams, despite her battles with substance abuse. Before she turned 19, Cara was working as a waitress while pursuing modeling, mainly in lingerie. She also thought about enrolling in cosmetology school to further her passion. Without prior connections in the modeling world, Cara uploaded her photo portfolio to a social network-like platform for photographers and models. On her profile, Cara described herself as responsible and passionate about modeling. She was new to the scene but took her work very seriously. Her mother, Julia, said modeling was like an escape for Cara, almost as if she took on another identity while doing it. In 2012, around her 19th birthday, Cara faced a setback. Her substance use led her to quit her waitress job, losing her main income source. That summer, she returned to her family home in Chicago, Illinois. Back under her parents' care, they convinced her to seek help, and she entered rehab to overcome her addictions. However, her stay was brief. She was expelled for not following the program rules. In August 2012, 19-year-old Cara decided to move back to Colorado Springs. She made friends with other local girls and kept daily contact with her older brother, Terry. On October 9th, 2012 at 11:45 p.m., Terry got a call from Cara, who said she was heading to Denver for a modeling job. That was the last time anyone heard from her. After that call, Cara vanished. 2 days later, on October 11th, after trying to reach her without success, Terry visited her rented room to check on her, which was unusual since he hadn't heard from her for a while. Cara's roommates, Jeremy Swope and Archie Escobedo, told him she had left for Denver on the night of October 9th. Later, her parents, Paul and Julia, came to Colorado to search for her. They found her makeup box, phone charger, and $300 in cash in her room, which was alarming as these items were precious to Cara, hinting she might be in trouble. However, it wasn't until October 14th that the family reported Cara missing to the authorities. Paul informed the sheriff's office about her history of substance abuse and recent rehab stint. According to Paul, the police didn't take the disappearance seriously, barely making an effort to announce it in local news, and suggested the family was overreacting since Cara was an adult and didn't need to check in daily. In December 2012, investigators learned about a photo of Cara on an adult content and escort service website. An anonymous tipster also claimed to have seen her in Las Vegas. Yet, after thorough digital tracking, detectives concluded that Cara wasn't connected to the escort ad. Her photo had been used without her involvement. The case's investigation progressed slowly in the months following her disappearance. Things changed when Detective Tammy Tadlock took over the case on February 4, 2013. By then, there were 2 more missing young models who had been seeking work on the same website Cara used to post her photos and portfolio. The then president of the National Coalition Against Violence and Exploitation of Women linked the site to at least 13 disappearances of young women who used the platform. The website issued a statement denying any wrongdoing, emphasizing their priority was to protect aspiring models and teach them how to spot scams. In the same year, Detective Tammy found an ad
on a website for sexual services dated October 9, 2012, featuring a photo of Cara in lingerie. This discovery opened new leads, revealing that only a few of Cara's friends knew she also worked as an escort. One of these friends, who met Cara at a party a year earlier and whose identity remained confidential,
shared that they both struggled with substance addiction and bonded over their time in rehab in 2012. This friend disclosed that Cara was never fully sober, regularly using small doses of heroin to stave off withdrawal symptoms, which helped her function daily. The friend also admitted to accompanying Cara to her escort appointments and confirmed that Cara financed her drug use with the money earned from these encounters. The case's renewed activity led to several calls to the authorities with potential leads. One call suggested shifting the investigation to Long Island, New York, but the law enforcement team found no evidence of Cara being there or involved in any sex trafficking network. On May 7, 2013, after accessing Cara's cell phone records, Detective Tammy's office left a voicemail for one of the last numbers contacted before Cara disappeared. The next day, Joel Hollendorfer, born November 19, 1975, and with a lengthy criminal record starting in the 1990s, returned the call. He had no known siblings and a history of theft, motor vehicle offenses, and harassment. Joel, who was 6 feet tall and weighed 194 pounds, had been married to Christina, with whom he had 2 children. His marriage was strained due to his drug addiction and frequent hiring of escorts. Joel's connection to Cara's disappearance seemed clear from the phone records, but his subsequent statement to Detective Tammy complicated the investigation. Joel confirmed owning the phone number in 2012 and said he spoke with a girl using a pseudonym that night. He claimed they texted and called for hours but never agreed on a meeting place, so he never met her in person. It was later confirmed that Cara worked as a prostitute under the pseudonym Joel mentioned. Detective Tammy pursued this lead, uncovering that Joel had listed his address in a place owned by his parents, John and Betty. A volunteer who analyzed Cara's phone records had been a reserve police officer in Santa Clara, California, and a manager for a special security program. A U.S.-based multinational company specializing in aerospace and military industries provided additional training to him in land navigation, a skill he used in the Army. Leveraging his acquired knowledge and the cell phone company's geolocation services, he mapped out Cara's last known movements from October 9th until the morning after, right before her phone went silent. According to the data, he placed Cara at the intersection of Goodman Road and Black Forest Road around midnight. This path, unusual in Cara's routine, was frequently traveled by Joel as it led to his house. Meanwhile, Detective Tammy discovered that on the day she disappeared, Cara spent time in her room with two brunette girls. By November 2013, authorities identified and located one of these girls from Colorado Springs, who cooperated with the investigation to piece together the events of October 9th until the friends parted ways. However, the second girl, who reportedly spent more hours with Cara that day, remained untraceable by Colorado authorities. Despite significant progress in piecing together Cara's last known activities and contacts, Detective Tammy was soon replaced as the lead investigator. Her successor doubted Cara's alleged modeling job in Denver, but couldn't prove or entirely dismiss it. More leads on Cara's whereabouts surfaced, yet none pointed in the right direction, with many suspected to be false, possibly meant to disrupt the search effort. Furthermore, new posts on the escort website featuring Cara's photos appeared, some dated months after her disappearance. Police analysis confirmed Cara had no connection with these ads. For months, the police traveled across various U.S. cities and states, following the scant leads from their investigation, but to no avail. However, Detective Tammy's efforts finally bore fruit on October 2, 2014, over a year after first contacting Joel. The police obtained a search warrant for his parents' property, executed 13 days later using ground-penetrating radar. The team identified several altered ground spots. Betty, Joel's mother, guided the search, pointing out areas where they had buried horses and other animals since they bought the property in the mid-1980s. No excavations were made at these suspected animal burial sites. However, Betty suggested searching another property accessible to Joel on Green Acres Road. She contacted the owners, who allowed the authorities to search it. This second search took place on October 21st and 22, 2014. On the day of the search at the Green Acres property, police experts positioned 4 bloodhound dogs at each corner of the area. Once released, all dogs headed straight to the same spot, an area that looked recently dug up, about the size of a grave, but no human remains were found there. When the search at Green Acres started, Joel was interviewed by the police. In the recorded conversation, he confirmed speaking with Cara in October 2012, but his story changed. He admitted planning to meet her at the Waffle House, but claimed she never showed up. He also mentioned that his regular encounters with sex workers and drug addiction were the main reasons for his divorce from Christina. The detective in charge, observing Joel's reactions, explained that they had tracked Cara's movements that night using her phone's geolocation. Joel became more attentive, and the detective revealed that the last known location of Cara was just a minute away from his parents' house. Joel suggested that Cara might have followed him home to rob him, maintaining that he never met her in person. Frustrated by Joel's lack of cooperation and without new evidence, the investigation stalled for years. A breakthrough came in 2022 when Colorado Springs police located Joel Hollendorfer in Virginia. She had been reluctant to cooperate with the initial investigation, but during a meeting with the FBI, she revealed that after her father-in-law's death in 2014, Joel confessed to accidentally killing a sex worker by suffocating her during sex. According to Christina, Joel said the body was buried at his parents' property, above a horse's grave. Later, in a phone interview, Christina expressed her belief that Joel's parents, John and Betty, knew their son was responsible for Cara's disappearance and were covering for him. This testimony led to Joel's arrest. In custody, he met with the police investigators. They showed him aerial photos of his parents' property and asked him to identify the animal burial sites. When asked about a specific spot, Joel denied anything was buried there. However, a week later, when Betty was questioned, she contradicted her son, identifying the same spot as the grave of Milo, her favorite horse. Authorities quickly mobilized to uncover the mystery behind Cara's disappearance. A team of volunteers and FBI agents began a new search on the property, focusing on the area where Betty's horse was believed to be buried. Less than 3 feet underground, they found human remains, which were carefully extracted and sent to forensic experts for identification. It was later confirmed the remains were Cara's. The autopsy report noted significant damage to her brain, liver, and muscle tissues, suggesting a possible heroin overdose. However, due to the body's advanced decomposition, the exact cause of death couldn't be determined, so the authorities relied on Christina's earlier statement for the official report. Joel was immediately arrested on charges of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. His bail was set at over $1 million. At a preliminary hearing on November 27, 2022, his defense lawyer argued that Cara's death was an accidental result of a consensual sexual encounter involving drug use, claiming Joel hid the body out of fear without intending her death. The prosecution countered this by stating that Cara had used up her remaining drugs hours before meeting Joel, making a drug overdose as the cause of death unlikely. They argued that Joel had killed her. The case judge concluded there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, ordering Joel to remain in custody without bail. The arraignment faced delays due to the defense's stalling tactics, aiming to buy time for Joel before the trial started. In January, when the first meeting between the prosecution and defense was scheduled, the defense lawyer chose not to make any statement. A month later, she pleaded not guilty on Joel's behalf, requesting a trial start date of June 12, 2023. In May, during a meeting discussing jury selection and media coverage, Joel's legal team objected to live social media broadcasts, arguing it could affect the trial's fairness. The defense also sought to dismiss the evidence tampering charge, citing the time elapsed since the incident. Finally, on June 10, 2023, over a decade after Cara's disappearance, the trial began. The prosecution made a striking start by displaying Cara's high school graduation photo, followed by images of the garbage bags where her remains were found. The prosecutor focused on Joel's actions, urging the jury not to scrutinize Cara's behavior. The defense attorney acknowledged Joel's involvement in Cara's death, but emphasized it was an accident, as per his ex-wife's statement. The trial featured 14 witnesses, including Cara's roommates, her family, her ex-boyfriend, and others who had contacted Cara for escort services, all claiming they never met her in person. Detective Tammy also testified, providing a detailed account of her investigation, followed by Christina, Joel's ex-partner. Christina delved deeper into their relationship during her testimony, especially highlighting Joel's 2014 confession. She described their marriage as unstable, marked by separations and reunions until they divorced in 2012. However, they reunited 2 years later. After Joel's father suddenly passed away, Joel took Christina in his truck to a gas station near his family's farm, where he confessed to killing Cara and mentioned he had disclosed the incident to his father, feeling he owed him an explanation after authorities searched the family property. Joel also believed he caused his father's death, attributing his heart attack to the shock of the confession. Christina, skeptical of Joel's story, remained silent on the matter until nearly a decade later when investigators approached her. The forensic pathologist who conducted the autopsy provided crucial testimony, noting high levels of heroin in Cara's system, but argued that drug overdose alone was an unlikely cause of death. He reasoned that Cara's habitual drug use would have increased her tolerance, making a fatal overdose less probable. However, he also noted that her heroin-affected state could have prevented her from breathing properly, not fully dismissing the defense's theory but maintaining a neutral stance, allowing both sides to leverage his testimony to support their arguments. Significant evidence presented at trial included the recording of Joel's first interview with Detective Tammy in 2014. After a lunch break, the prosecution called various crime scene experts who had been part of the initial search at the property where Cara's body was found, including volunteer geologists who explained the use of specialized equipment in 2014 to detect human remains, noting that while anomalies were found on the property, they could not confirm the presence of human remains at that time. In their closing arguments, the prosecution proposed that Joel, fueled by anger from being spurned by his ex-wife, sought out Cara for a paid sexual encounter. They suggested that his rage escalated during the meeting, leading him to strangle her to death. In the final stretch of the trial, the prosecution laid out evidence of Joel's repeated attempts to call his ex-wife on the day he met Cara, just hours before their encounter. The prosecutor challenged the notion that Joel's actions were merely reactions to an overdose death, suggesting instead that they aligned more with an intentional killing. The defense admitted Joel's actions were wrong, but argued there was no concrete proof of his intent to kill. The defense's closing argument hinged on the lack of evidence to dispute the claim that Cara's death was accidental. 12 days into the trial, after nearly 5 hours of jury deliberation, Joel was found guilty of manslaughter, significantly reducing his potential sentence. Cara's mother, Julia, presented a heartfelt testimony that echoed the family's deep disappointment and shock at the verdict, feeling the jury failed to grasp the crime's severity. The judge, bound by the jury's decision, noted that Joel's prior convictions would be considered aggravating factors, potentially extending his prison time. On August 31, 2023, Joel was sentenced to 24 years in prison. This sentence left Cara's family and friends deeply disappointed, feeling the defense had unfairly blamed the victim. Cara's loved ones vowed to attend every parole hearing to ensure Joel serves his full sentence, publicly opposing any future parole. While Julia appreciated the judge considering the aggravating factors, she found the 24-year sentence too lenient, given the crime's gravity and the time Joel hid her 19-year-old daughter's body. The family also criticized the media's portrayal of Cara, arguing that instead of remembering her as the vibrant and kind person she was depicted as just another sex worker and addict. They emphasized that her profession did not justify her murder and the subsequent concealment of her body, which caused immense pain to her loved ones. The Lykens couple had an unstable marriage. They often traveled around Indiana selling candy, beer, and soda at carnival stands throughout the summer, frequently relocating and consistently facing severe financial challenges. The Lykens sons regularly traveled with them to help with their work, but Sylvia and Jenny were discouraged from joining, mainly out of concern for their safety and education. As a result, the sisters often stayed with relatives, usually their grandmother. By June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny were living with their parents in Indianapolis. On July 3rd, their mother was arrested and subsequently jailed for shoplifting. Shortly after, Lester Lykens arranged for his daughters to stay with Gertrude Banaszewski, a mother of 2 girls, Paula and Stephanie, whom the sisters had recently met at Arsenal Technical High School. When making this arrangement, Gertrude assured Lester that she would take care of his daughters as if they were her own children, but the reality would prove tragically different. Sylvia Marie Lykens was born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana, USA. She was the third of 5 children born to carnival workers Lester Lykens and his wife, Betty Lykens, formerly Grimes when she was single. Sylvia grew up between 2 sets of twins, Daniel and Diana, who were 2 years older, and Benny and Jenny, who were a year younger. Her little sister Jenny had polio, which weakened one of her legs significantly, causing her to limp noticeably. She had to wear a steel brace on her leg to help her walk. Her parents, Lester and Betty, had a rocky marriage. They often sold candy, beer, and soft drinks at carnival booths throughout Indiana all summer long, constantly moving and frequently facing serious financial difficulties. The Lykens children sometimes traveled with them to help out, but Sylvia and Jenny often stayed with relatives, mostly with their grandmother. This arrangement not only kept the young girls safe, but also allowed them to continue their education more steadily. From a young age, Sylvia took on babysitting and did errands for neighbors and friends. She also did household chores like ironing clothes, earning a little bit of money to buy things for herself. She often shared her earnings with her mom. Those who knew her said Sylvia was a friendly, confident, and charming girl. She had long, wavy, light brown hair that fell just below her shoulders. Her friends called her Cookie. Despite her vibrant personality, Sylvia was self-conscious about her smile because she was missing a front tooth, which she lost while playing with one of her brothers as a child. She loved music, especially the Beatles, and was very protective of her younger sister Jenny. Jenny was much shyer and less secure. The sisters often visited a local skating rink where Sylvia would help Jenny skate, holding her hand as Jenny relied heavily on her stronger leg. In June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Lykens were living with their parents in Indianapolis. The following month, their mother was arrested and later jailed for theft. Shortly thereafter, Lester arranged for his younger daughters to stay with Gertrude Banaszewski, a mother of 2 girls, Paula and Stephanie, whom the Lykens sisters had met at Arsenal Technical High School. Gertrude assured Lester that she would look after the girls as if they were her own until his return. A little after the 4th of July celebrations, the Lykens sisters moved to 3850 East New York Street, while their father, older brothers, and later their mother went to the East Coast with the carnival. The deal with Gertrude was that she would receive $20 a week in exchange for hosting Sylvia and Jenny and taking care of them until they returned in November. Initially, everything at the Banaszewski home seemed normal. Sylvia got along well with Stephanie, singing along to pop records and willingly helping with household chores. The Lykens sisters regularly attended Sunday school with the other Banaszewski children, and the pastor praised Sylvia's kindness and respect for sacred matters. Although Lester had agreed to pay Gertrude, the payments started to arrive late, usually a day or 2 beyond the scheduled dates. However, this delay soon began to irritate Gertrude. Out of frustration, she started mistreating the girls, beginning with spanking them on their bare buttocks with various instruments, such as a 1/4 inch thick paddle, making statements such as, "Well, I took care of you 2 little bitches for a week for nothing." As the payment delays became more frequent, the beatings and mistreatment escalated. On one occasion, both girls were hit about 15 times on the back with the paddle after Paula accused them of eating too much at a church dinner they had attended with the other children. It had only been a month since they had been staying with the Banaszewski family, and it was now the end of August. By that time, Gertrude had begun to focus all her frustration and abuse almost exclusively on Sylvia. Some speculated that jealousy might have been the driving factor, as Sylvia was not only beautiful, but also had her whole life ahead of her. As the days went by, the abuse and mistreatment escalated. In addition to more frequent beatings, the sisters, particularly Sylvia, were starved. Often they were only given leftovers or spoiled food from the trash cans. On one occasion, Sylvia was accused of stealing candies, though she had actually bought them. Another time, she was publicly humiliated. Sylvia claimed she had a boyfriend in Long Beach, whom she had met in the spring when her family lived in California. As she shared stories about those days with Stephanie and Jenny, Sylvia mentioned that once She had snuggled under the covers with her boyfriend. Hearing this, Gertrude asked, "Why did you do that, Sylvia?" Sylvia shrugged and replied, "I don't know," and shrugged. A few days later, Gertrude brought up the topic again, suggesting mockingly, "Your stomach seems to be getting bigger, Sylvia. Looks like you might be having a baby." Sylvia thought it was a joke and responded, "Yeah, it must be getting big then." The abuse escalated. Gertrude repeatedly brought up Sylvia's interactions with boys, insinuating that any contact would surely lead to pregnancy. Suddenly, one day she kicked Sylvia in the genitals. Paula, one of Gertrude's daughters who was overweight, 3 months pregnant and jealous of Sylvia's looks, joined in the attack. She pulled Sylvia from her chair to the kitchen floor and yelled, "You're not fit to sit in a chair." On another occasion, while the family was having dinner, Gertrude, Paula, and a neighborhood boy named Randy Gordon Lepper forced Sylvia to eat a hot dog overloaded with mustard, ketchup, and other spices. Naturally, Sylvia vomited, and they cruelly made her swallow what she had thrown up. Exhausted from all the abuse, Sylvia apparently spread a rumor at school accusing Stephanie and Paula of prostitution. One day, a boy made propositions to Stephanie at school, mentioning Sylvia had started the rumor. When they got home from school, Stephanie confronted Sylvia, who admitted to starting the rumor. In retaliation, Stephanie punched Sylvia hard. Sylvia, crying, apologized, and Stephanie also started crying. Randolph Hubbard, 15, Stephanie's boyfriend, learned about the incident and the rumors and brutally attacked Sylvia. He slapped her, slammed her head against the wall, and then threw her down on the floor. Gertrude also joined in, repeatedly using the paddle to beat Sylvia. Every day at the Banishevsky residence was a nightmare, with the episodes of violence only worsening. On one occasion, Paula punched Sylvia in the face with such force that she fractured her own wrist, focusing all her blows on Sylvia's mouth and eyes. Later, Paula used the cast on her arm to hit Sylvia even harder. But the violence wasn't just physical. The Lykens sisters were also subjected to verbal and psychological abuse. On one occasion, Gertrude accused Sylvia of being promiscuous and engaging in prostitution. She delivered a lengthy tirade about the filth of prostitution and the degradation of women in general. Afterwards, she forced young Jenny to hit her own older sister, threatening that if she didn't comply, she would suffer the same fate as Sylvia. The assaults on the Lykens girls didn't only come from the Banishevsky family. Coy Hubbard and several of his classmates frequently visited Gertrude's home and tormented Sylvia both physically and verbally. Often Gertrude's own children, and even Gertrude herself, would join in to inflict harm on Sylvia. The neighborhood children routinely beat Sylvia. Sometimes they used her as a practice dummy in violent judo sessions, sawing her body, burning her skin with burning sticks. They went so far as to severely injure little Sylvia's genitals. To entertain Gertrude and her teenage accomplices, Sylvia was forced to undress in the living room and masturbate with a bottle. Afterwards, Gertrude would tell everyone that this act of humiliation was to show Jenny what kind of girl her sister was. Over time, Gertrude banned Sylvia from attending school after she confessed to stealing a gym suit from school. She had only taken it because Gertrude refused to buy her clothes. This not only disrupted her education but also led to severe punishment. Gertrude repeatedly beat Sylvia with a 7-centimeter wide police belt. Gertrude shifted the conversation to the evils of premarital sex and then brutally kicked Lykens in the genitals. During this attack, Stephanie came to Lykens' defense, shouting, "She didn't do anything." Gertrude continued her torment by burning Lykens' fingertips with matches before further whipping her. A few days later, Gertrude again used the police belt to repeatedly whip Jenny after she reportedly stole a single tennis shoe from school to wear on her stronger foot. Due to the increasing frequency and brutality of the torture and mistreatment, Sylvia gradually became incontinent. She was denied access to the bathroom and was forced to wet herself as a form of punishment for her incontinence. On October 6, 1965, Gertrude threw Sylvia Lykens into the basement and tied her up. She often kept Sylvia naked, barely fed her, and frequently denied her water. Sylvia was almost always tied to the stair railing in the basement, with her feet barely touching the ground. The Banishevsky family occasionally paused their physical and mental torment to watch their favorite TV shows. They even involved neighborhood boys who paid 5 cents each to see Sylvia's body displayed and to participate in humiliating her, beating her, burning her, and ultimately mutilating her. During her captivity in the basement, Gertrude and her children tied and gagged Sylvia, then placed her in a bathtub filled with scalding water. They proceeded to rub salt into her wounds. Shortly after this incident, the father of a neighborhood boy named Michael John Monroe anonymously called Arsenal School to report that a girl with open sores all over her body was living at the Banishevsky house. Since Sylvia had not attended school for several days, a school nurse visited Gertrude's address to investigate. Gertrude told the nurse that Sylvia had run away from home the previous week and that she did not know her whereabouts. She added that Sylvia was out of control and that her open sores were the result of her refusal to maintain personal hygiene. Gertrude also claimed that Sylvia was a bad influence on both her own children and her sister. The school did not conduct any further investigations into Sylvia's whereabouts or well-being. In mid-October, John Banishevsky Jr. cruelly tormented Sylvia by offering her a plate of soup and swiftly pulling it away as she tried to eat with her hands. By then, Sylvia was already suffering from extreme malnutrition. That day, Gertrude Banishevsky allowed Sylvia to sleep upstairs, but only on the condition that she did not wet the bed. At night, Sylvia quietly asked Jenny to give her a glass of water in secret before she went to sleep. The next morning, Gertrude discovered that the girl had peed herself. As punishment, she was once again forced to masturbate using a glass bottle in the presence of the Banishevsky children. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude shouted for Lykens to return to the kitchen, then ordered her to strip naked before proclaiming to her, "You have branded my daughters. Now I'm going to brand you." She began carving the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," onto Lykens' abdomen with a heated needle. When Gertrude was unable to complete the markings, she instructed one of the neighborhood kids, 14-year-old Richard Dean Hobbs, to finish etching the words into Lykens' flesh as she took Jenny to a nearby grocery store. In what Hobbs would later insist were short, light etchings. He continued to brand the text into Lykens' abdomen as she clenched her teeth and moaned. Richard, like 10-year-old Shirley, took Sylvia to the basement, where they each proceeded to use an anchor bolt in an attempt to burn the letter S beneath Lykens' left breast, although they applied one section of the loop backwards, and this deep burn scar would resemble the number 3. On that grim night, after enduring terrible abuse, Sylvia told her sister Jenny, "I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die, I'm sure of it." The next day, Gertrude woke Sylvia and forced her to write a letter while dictating its contents. The plan was sinister. They intended to deceive the Lykens parents into believing that Sylvia had run away from the Banishevsky residence. The content of this letter was intended to frame a group of anonymous local boys for extensively abusing and mutilating Lykens after she had initially agreed to engage in sexual relations with them before they inflicted the extreme abuse and torture upon her body. After Lykens had written this letter, Gertrude finished formulating her plan to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia, then take her to a nearby wooded area known as Jimmy's Forest and leave her there to die. Sylvia was once again tied to the stair railing in the basement. Gertrude offered her cookies to eat, but Sylvia refused them, saying, "Give them to the dog, I don't want them." In response, Gertrude forcefully stuffed the cookies into Sylvia's mouth, and she and John began to beat her, focusing on her stomach. On the morning of October 26th, Sylvia was unable to speak intelligibly or coordinate her limb movements properly. Gertrude took her to the kitchen, leaned her against the wall, and tried to feed her a donut and a glass of milk, but Sylvia couldn't hold the glass properly. Frustrated, Gertrude threw Sylvia to the floor and then returned her to the basement. Soon after, Sylvia became delirious, moaning and muttering repeatedly. When Paula asked Sylvia to recite the English alphabet, Sylvia could not get past the first 4 letters or get up from the floor. That afternoon, several of the neighborhood tormentors gathered in the basement. Sylvia flailed her arms in an apparent attempt to point out the faces of the tormentors she recognized, shouting names like, "You're Ricky" and "You're Gertie." Minutes later, Sylvia tried unsuccessfully to bite into a rotten pear she was given, saying she couldn't feel her teeth. Hearing this, Jenny reminded her, "Don't you remember, Sylvia? Your front tooth fell out when you were 7 years old." Exhausted from all the abuse and certain she would die there, Sylvia desperately tried to escape the basement but collapsed without the strength to make it up the stairs. This attempt was met with the harshest of punishments. Gertrude struck Sylvia's head with excessive violence. Sylvia lost consciousness, and Gertrude just stood by, watching her for a while. Shortly after, at 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs returned to the Banaszewski residence and immediately went to the basement. He found Stephanie crying and embracing Sylvia's emaciated and lacerated body after their mother had ordered her to clean Sylvia's body. Stephanie and Richard then decided to give Sylvia a warm, soapy bath and dress her in clean clothes. They laid her on a mattress in one of the bedrooms. Sylvia murmured her last wish, hoping her father would be with her, or at least that she could be taken home. After enduring severe punishment and weakened from lack of food, Sylvia finally succumbed to her injuries and died. When Stephanie realized Sylvia wasn't breathing, she tried to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, while Gertrude repeatedly screamed at the children in the house that Sylvia was faking her death. Initially, Gertrude hit Sylvia's body with a book, yelling at her that she was lying and pretending in an attempt to wake her. Soon, in a panic, Gertrude told Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. When the police arrived at their address around 6:30 p.m., Gertrude led the officers to the bedroom. She showed them Sylvia's extensively beaten and mutilated body lying on a dirty mattress. She then handed them the letter that Sylvia had been forced to write. Gertrude also claimed that she had been caring for the young girl for an hour or more before her death, after having applied antiseptic to Sylvia's wounds in a futile attempt at first aid. She told the police that Sylvia had run away from home with several teenagers before returning to her house that afternoon, bare-chested and with the note in her hands. Holding a Bible, Paula, having declared to everyone in the house that Sylvia's death was meant to happen, looked at Jenny and calmly said, "If you want to live with us, Jenny, we'll treat you like our own sister." Following instructions she had received before the police arrived, Jenny recited the rehearsed version of the events leading up to Sylvia's death, before whispering to the officers to take them away and that she would tell them everything. The formal statement provided by Jenny Lykens led to the arrest of Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. Banaszewski on suspicion of Sylvia's murder, just hours after her body was discovered. The same day, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same crimes. The three older Banaszewski children, along with Coy Hubbard, were placed in a nearby juvenile detention center. The younger Banaszewski children and Richard Hobbs were held at the Indianapolis Child Guardian's home. All were detained without bail pending trial. Initially, Gertrude denied any involvement in Sylvia Lykens' death, though just a day into her detention, she confessed to knowing the children and acknowledged that her daughter Paula and Coy Hubbard had physically and emotionally abused Sylvia. Gertrude also admitted to forcing the girl to sleep in the basement on approximately 3 occasions when she had wet the bed. She became evasive when an officer suggested that the probable reasons for Sylvia's incontinence were her mental distress and kidney injuries. Paula, showing no remorse, signed a statement admitting she had repeatedly beaten Sylvia. She also confessed to an incident where Sylvia's wrist was fractured and admitted to other acts of brutality, such as pushing her down the basement stairs 2 or 3 times. John Jr. confessed to whipping Sylvia once and often used his fist to abuse her. He admitted to burning Sylvia with matches on several occasions and added that his mother had repeatedly burned the girl with cigarettes. The autopsy of Sylvia Lykens' body revealed she had suffered over 150 separate injuries across her body and was extremely emaciated at the time of her death. The injuries varied in location, nature, severity, and healing stage. They included burns, severe bruises, and extensive damage to muscles and nerves. Her vaginal cavity was swollen and nearly closed, though an examination determined her hymen was still intact, debunking Gertrude's claims that Sylvia had been 3 months pregnant and the accusations of prostitution and promiscuity. The official cause of Sylvia Marie Lykens' death was identified as subdural hematoma resulting from a strong blow to the right side of her head. The shock she suffered, primarily due to severe and prolonged damage to her skin and subcutaneous tissue, as well as chronic malnutrition, were also noted by the doctor in relation to Sylvia's death. Rigor mortis had fully developed by the time her body was discovered, indicating that Sylvia could have been dead for up to 8 hours before she was found. Although the autopsy doctor noted that Sylvia had been bathed recently, possibly post-mortem, this action could have accelerated the loss of body temperature and therefore the onset of rigor mortis. Gertrude Banaszewski, her eldest daughter Paula, her son John, and 2 neighborhood youths, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs, were tried and convicted in May 1966 for the neglect, torture, and murder of Sylvia Lykens. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gertrude Banaszewski guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment but was paroled in 1985. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder and was released in 1972. Hobbs, Hubbard, and John were found guilty of manslaughter and spent less than 2 years in the Indiana Reformatory before being granted parole on February 27, 1968. The citizens of Indiana consider the torture and murder of Sylvia Lykens the worst crime ever committed in their state, and a lead investigator from the Indiana Police Department has described it as the most sadistic case he investigated in his 35 years of service. Sylvia died on October 26th in Indianapolis, Indiana, USA. Her parents were supposed to return for her and her sister in November, but Sylvia passed away before their arrival. The Lykens sisters were fearful of reporting the increasing incidents of abuse and neglect to family members or adults at their school, worried that doing so might worsen their already dire situation. Both sisters feared that speaking out would only worsen their situation. Jenny, the younger sister, struggled against the urge to inform family members because Gertrude had threatened that she would be abused and tortured just as her sister was if she spoke up. Jenny also faced harassment from neighborhood girls who ridiculed or occasionally beat her whenever she mentioned Sylvia's situation. The closest neighbors of the Banishevsky residence, a middle-aged couple, along with other families in the neighborhood, suspected or had seen signs that the girls were being mistreated, but no one dared to report it to the authorities. Nothing was done to stop the abuse the Lykens sisters were enduring, and no one could rescue them in time from this nightmare. All those involved in her torture and murder were sentenced to prison. Although some of the culprits did not serve their full sentences, they could not escape the scars and the horror they caused, which will follow them for the rest of their lives. Stephanie Bennett was born on August 30, 1979, in the small American town of Rocky Mount, Virginia. After her parents divorced during her childhood, Stephanie lived with her mother. Despite the divorce, her father lived nearby, and Stephanie would see him nearly every day. Later on, her father remarried, giving Stephanie a stepsister named Diana. Upon finishing high school, Stephanie attended Roanoke College, which was 350 kilometers from her home. In her senior year, she met a young man named Walter, and they started dating. After college, the couple split but continued their relationship even as they moved to different cities. Stephanie moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, alongside her stepsister Diana and a mutual friend named Emily. The three shared an apartment in the Bridgeport residential complex located in a quiet, peaceful area on the outskirts of the city. Stephanie secured a job at IBM, while her boyfriend moved to Greenville, South Carolina, to pursue an engineering degree. After living in Raleigh for about a year, and with Stephanie recently having turned 23, she, her stepsister, and her friend were planning to relocate to different cities. Stephanie intended to move to Greenville to be with Walter, and the couple had already begun looking for a place to live together. In May, Stephanie visited Greenville, where she and Walter viewed several apartments and chose one suitable for them. Upon her return to Raleigh, she found that Emily had moved to another city, and Diana had left for a few days to attend a funeral. On the night of May 20, Stephanie came home from work and spoke on the phone with Walter, who was to fax her the lease agreement for the new apartment for her signature. They agreed that Walter would send it the following day when Stephanie could use the fax machine at her workplace. The next day, Walter was unable to reach Stephanie by phone, either at work or at home. After several unsuccessful attempts and Stephanie failing to show up for work, her friends and family became concerned and contacted the police. When the police arrived at her apartment, they found Stephanie deceased on the floor of her bedroom. Upon finding identification documents and confirming through a photograph, they identified Stephanie as the victim. Investigators noted a dirty clothes hamper under the window of Emily's bedroom, which had been moved. They surmised that the killer could have entered the apartment through the window. Additionally, they found the home phone in Emily's bedroom closet with its cord cut, suggesting the perpetrator had hidden there and disabled the phone to prevent the victim from using it. After speaking with Diana, the police learned that several items were missing from the apartment. The perpetrator had taken $8 from Stephanie's wallet, 2 recorders, and the clothes hamper from Stephanie's room, presumably to carry the stolen items. Forensic experts found DNA evidence on the victim and took a sample, but it did not match any records in the FBI database. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Notably, the murder weapon was not found at the scene, leading to the belief that the killer had taken it. Investigators interviewed other residents of the apartment complex, hoping someone might have seen the killer. During these interviews, it came to light that for several months, residents have reported someone lurking around and peeping through windows of the complex. The manager was questioned, but the complex administration could not locate the suspect. Notably, at least once, this individual was seen at Stephanie's window. Moreover, a few months before, an unknown man attacked a woman jogging near the lake by the complex. After this incident, Stephanie was scared to stay alone in her apartment and wished to move to Greenville as soon as possible. Investigators examined the complex's surroundings and found something peculiar. In the bushes, they discovered several dozen women's underwear, later identified as belonging to Stephanie. The police theorized that the murderer might have taken these from the apartment, but then discarded them in the bushes for some reason. However, this theory was soon disproved. It turned out that a teenager living in the adjacent apartment regularly entered Stephanie's room and stole her underwear, then discarded them in the bushes. The young man admitted this when questioned by investigators, but denied any involvement in the murder. His DNA did not match the sample from the crime scene, so he was no longer considered a suspect. The police thought that the man who had been spying on women through the apartment windows was the most obvious candidate for the murder. After speaking with everyone who had seen this mare, the detectives created a composite sketch and published it in the newspapers, but without success. As standard procedure, investigators checked Stephanie's boyfriend, who voluntarily provided a DNA sample that did not match the murderer's. Additionally, at the time of the murder, Walter was several hundred kilometers away and could not physically have been at the scene. Subsequently, the police asked all the men in the complex to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. This also yielded no results. No match was found among the 283 DNA profiles received, and at this point, there were no significant leads. Detectives organized surveillance of the apartment complex in hopes of catching the man who had been spying on residents. To their surprise, they soon succeeded. On June 3, police observed a man approaching several ground floor windows and looking inside the homes. While at one of the windows, this man began to masturbate, and the police immediately arrested him. This individual turned out to be Christopher Lee, who had been convicted multiple times for peeping and stalking women, including a 3-year prison sentence for harassment in 2000. The detectives thought they had finally caught the killer, but were disappointed. Christopher's DNA did not match the sample found on Stephanie's body. He was charged with peeping but was no longer considered a suspect in the murder. The police continued working on the case without any significant leads. A year later, the lead detective heard about a lab in Florida that could determine a person's ethnic ancestry based on their DNA. Despite doubts about this technology, he did not want to miss an opportunity, so he sent the DNA of 4 of his colleagues of different ethnic backgrounds as a test. The experts completed the task with 100% accuracy, and the detective then submitted the killer's DNA from Stephanie's case. At the lab, they determined that the DNA owner was Caucasian, but this information did not significantly aid the police. In August 2003, the victim's father offered a $100,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of the killer. Stephanie's mother wrote a letter published in local newspapers, imploring people to share any information with the police that could help identify the suspect. This generated some new leads, but they led nowhere. In April 2004, based on numerous witness accounts, the detectives decided to re-interview all residents of the complex. They learned that the man arrested for peeping might not be the only one lurking around the complex buildings and looking through others' windows. Having identified the first man and possessing his photos, the investigators wanted to speak again with residents who had seen a man spying around. Unfortunately, none had seen his face. He often appeared during the dark hours, wearing a hood over his head. Some witnesses mentioned they had seen him without a hood, but could only make out his long hair. Detectives interviewed dozens of individuals until they finally found someone who had seen this person near Stephanie Bennett's window before her murder. This witness already had given a statement to the police, but now remembered something else. He saw the man a few days after the incident. The man was walking his dog near a wooded area behind the residential complex, recognizable by his hoodie. The witness watched the man until he disappeared among the trees with his Labrador. It seemed the witness had either forgotten this detail or hadn't thought it related to the murder. So the police didn't have this information during the initial interrogations. 2 years after Stephanie's death, detectives learned they should be looking for a man with a Labrador who, since he walked the dog in that area, likely lived nearby. Detectives found an interesting fact. There was another residential complex behind the wooded area where the man was spotted. Assuming the dog owner might live there, the police inquired with the complex staff if they knew of a man with a Labrador. They were immediately given the name Drew Planton, a 35-year-old regarded as somewhat odd by complex employees. He was described as reclusive, hardly speaking to anyone, never making eye contact, and always wearing loose-fitting clothing, presumably to avoid drawing attention to himself. Upon further investigation, they spoke with an elderly resident who kept an eye on the complex's goings-on. When told they were investigating Stephanie Bennett's murder, she expressed surprise that no one had been arrested, mentioning that boy with the big dog as a known figure. The residents had suspected this man, but had not reported their suspicions to the police. Drew had since moved elsewhere in the city. The detectives attempted to contact him at his new apartment, but received no response despite repeated visits at various times. While searching for Drew, the police interviewed his neighbors who shared alarming details. A woman living above him saw Drew with a young man shortly after Stephanie's murder, and Drew was reportedly telling the young man not to talk to the police. This led investigators to believe that the young man might have been involved in the theft of undergarments from the victim's apartment. Other women had felt menaced by Drew. They observed him while jogging or in secluded places, watching closely or even following them. Unable to contact Drew at home, detectives found his workplace and approached him there. Drew, a chemist in a fertilizer production lab, denied knowledge of Stephanie Bennett's murder, which was odd considering his close proximity to the crime scene. He was uncooperative, but agreed to answer questions at his home at a scheduled time. When detectives met with him at his apartment, he denied ever walking his dog near Stephanie's complex. Given the numerous witnesses who had seen him in the area, the detectives immediately suspected he was lying. He also claimed not to wear glasses, contrary to his driver's license information and witness descriptions of a man peering into apartment windows wearing glasses. Predictably, Drew refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. The detectives decided to surveil him in hopes of obtaining a DNA sample by other means, but this proved challenging as he left no items behind that could be analyzed in a lab. For example, during lunchtime, he would leave work, sit in his car, and simply stare at a fixed point. Didn't the man eat anything? As a result, detectives were unable to retrieve any object with his DNA. Detectives observed as Drew discarded an empty water bottle into a trash container. They retrieved it and took it to the laboratory. However, the experts were unable to obtain a DNA sample from it. According to one account, Drew deliberately took a clean bottle and threw it away on the street, knowing he was under surveillance. After that, the police decided to try and obtain his trash, but they also failed in this endeavor. For several days, they never saw him take out the trash. Notably, the man's neighbors also couldn't recall ever seeing him with a trash bag. Later, the investigators sought assistance from Drew's boss. She agreed to help them obtain an item from his workplace that might contain his DNA. She observed him for several days, but was never able to retrieve any object. Drew rarely ate at work, never discarded anything, and not a single hair could be found in his office. Given that the man had long hair, this seemed odd. The investigators were already convinced that Drew was meticulously eliminating any traces so they couldn't obtain his DNA. Once, the boss saw him pick up his hair and tie it with an elastic band. After that, he meticulously picked up any strands that had fallen to the floor. Then the woman decided to invite him to lunch at a cafe to supposedly discuss some work matters. But even there, the man was extremely cautious. Eating mostly with his hands, he stored all used napkins in his pocket and even took the straw and the glass with his drink. For dessert, he ordered banana pudding, and Drew finally used a fork. However, after using it, He cleaned the fork with a damp napkin for 15 minutes, eliminating any possibility of obtaining a DNA sample from the utensil. Despite this, the investigators took the fork and brought it to the laboratory. The experts were able to find small DNA samples that showed a partial match with the DNA at the crime scene of Stephanie Bennett. However, the result was too inconclusive as more biological material was needed for a complete comparison. In the end, the detectives obtained a search warrant for Drew's workplace, hoping to find an item containing his DNA. The investigators were also concerned that the man might flee once he realized they were executing the search warrant, so they decided to conduct it at night. Among the suspect's belongings, they found gloves he was supposed to use while working with chemicals. The detectives suspected that his DNA might be inside the gloves, so they took them and replaced them with another pair. They still feared that Drew might flee if he realized the police had his DNA. Experts found biological material inside the gloves, and the DNA analysis showed a complete match. Finally, the detectives were confident that Drew was responsible for the murder of Stephanie Bennett and had undeniable evidence in their hands. On October 18, 2005, the police quietly surrounded the laboratory where the man worked and waited for him to exit. The investigators feared that attempting to arrest him inside the building might lead to him taking a colleague as a hostage or attacking them. These fears were not unfounded, as when the man left the building, they immediately arrested him. They found a loaded firearm in his possession, indicating he was well aware that the police were close to capturing him and had no intention of surrendering easily. During the interrogation, which lasted more than 6 hours, Drew did not say a word, refused food and water, and barely moved. In the end, detectives had to place him in a wheelchair to move him around. With a search warrant for his apartment, the investigators found a stash of stolen clothing belonging to Stephanie. Additionally, they discovered 9 pistols, 2 rifles, 40 knives, a pair of handcuffs, and a machete. They also found lock-picking tools and handcuffs. The detectives came across a notebook with dozens of women's names, which they immediately started to trace to ensure their safety. It turned out that one of the women was the same resident of his apartment complex who had complained about Drew during the interrogation. She said that the man watched her on the street, and she felt consistently uncomfortable. Her fears were confirmed when the police found her underwear and tampons in Drew's house. Moreover, there was a copy of her high school graduation videotape. It turned out that Drew had entered her apartment, taken the tape, made a copy, and returned it. All this time, he had kept these items even after moving. In his apartment, they also found a check made out to the woman who was murdered in 1999. The investigators discovered that at that time, Drew lived in the same city. Additionally, the woman had been killed with a firearm of a quite rare caliber. But it was precisely that weapon, found in the man's collection during the search, that made Drew a suspect in this case. However, he first had to stand trial for the murder of Stephanie Bennett. A month after his arrest, the prosecution officially announced that they would seek the death penalty. The trial was set to begin the following year, and Drew spent that time in solitary confinement, but the trial never took place. On January 1, 2006, Drew was found dead in his cell, despite all the precautions that were in place. The investigators had no doubt that Drew had killed Stephanie Bennett, but after searching his house, the inevitable question arose: how many other victims might this person have had? At the very least, it was probable that he had been behind the murder of a woman in 1999. The detectives were almost certain that Drew might have been involved in other crimes as well. After carefully studying his background, the police uncovered several interesting details. Drew was raised in a complete family with 3 siblings. His father constantly humiliated and beat the children until their mother fled with them to another state. As a result, Drew became a very introverted teenager, a trait that intensified over time. Despite this, he received a good education and found a decent job as a chemist. His colleagues said that he was very intelligent, but his social skills were practically non-existent. He had no friends, did not talk to anyone at work, and always tried to keep as far away from the group as possible. Interestingly, Drew's biological brother also had a criminal record. He spied on women with a hidden camera and received a suspended sentence. In 2008, Drew's mother sued the state government, accusing the authorities of allowing her son's death. However, the judge concluded that the prison guards had taken all necessary precautions and could not have stopped the man. Stephanie Bennett's father tried to sue the management of the apartment complex for ignoring residents' reports of a man who was spying, as well as for not paying enough attention to the safety of residents on the premises. According to him, there was insufficient lighting around the buildings in the dark, and anyone could walk there unnoticed. He also found out that the window of his daughter's apartment was broken, but the complex's management did not rush to fix this problem, despite it being their direct duty. In the end, however, he withdrew these accusations without commenting on his decision. Thus, this complex and puzzling case was finally resolved. The police still wonder today how many other victims might Drew have had. The available information suggests that the man was prone to committing serial crimes, but after his death, it became practically impossible to know the truth.